1, 2, 3, 4.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to today's session. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with a review of the Philippines. In accordance with Resolution 5/1, the review is based on 1. The national report, 2. The compilation of UN information, and 3. The summary of stakeholders' information, both prepared by the OHCHR. I have now the honor to give the floor to Honorable Jesus Crispin Rimola, Secretary of the Department of Justice, to introduce the report. Sir, you have the floor.
Madam Vice President, Excellencies, on behalf of the 110 million Filipinos in our country and all over the world, my delegation of senior officials from our capital and here in Geneva extends warm greetings to everyone. The Philippines looks at the Universal Periodic Review as a valuable platform for peer review in the implementation of recommendations made since our third cycle review in 2017. On this note, consistent with our duty and obligations to promote, protect, and fulfill human rights of our people, we take pride in underlining our significant accomplishments and best practices in human rights promotion and protection. We now once again look forward to constructive comments and recommendations from member states and stakeholders during this present review process. Let me take this opportunity to update you on the Philippine Human Rights Agenda, which consists of 4 pillars. Number 1, transformational reform for justice and law enforcement sectors. Number 2, investments in economic, social, and cultural rights of our citizens. Number 3, protection of vulnerable groups. And number 4, constructive and open engagement with the international community. Last month, I reported to the Human Rights Council on the transformative agenda that our government of President Ferdinand R. Marcos is undertaking to deliver real justice in real time. This is a continuous, concerted, and coordinated effort led by the Department of Justice to ensure that our citizens' human rights are protected, promoted, and maintained, anchored upon the respect for rule of law and due process. Much-needed reforms, process-driven, cut through the 5 pillars of the criminal justice system in our country. President Marcos has set the tone at the top, calling on the Philippine National Police to use force only when necessary and make sure it is accountable and justifiable. He has refocused the anti-illegal drug campaign by tackling poverty eradication and by giving priority to rehabilitation, prevention, education, and assistance to victims and their families. As we embark on a more inclusive and empowering system of social justice, the Department of Justice has enacted concrete measures to change the culture of our judicial and law enforcement processes, to inject human rights into every step of the way, to protect human dignity of all, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized, and uphold our constitutional values as a deeply caring and compassionate society. Allow me to share some practical examples in our quest for reform in our justice system, as I believe the numbers and changes on the ground speak louder than any words. In the recent case of journalist Percy Lapid, who was assassinated, we were able to take resolute and proactive action upon the express directive of the President himself. In 17 days since we were assigned to the case, we completed the investigation, case build-up, and filing of charges against a high-ranking government official, the first in decades. In the process, we uncovered a deeply rooted criminal enterprise inside the corrections pillar, another pillar of our justice system. In September and October this year, we released 728 persons deprived of their liberty from prison, many of whom had already served their sentences. I am personally committed to continuing regular releases and aim to have 5,000 released by June next year. Number three, we are decongesting our correction system by decentralizing our prisons, consistent with the Regionalization of Prisons Act. Plans are underway for the transfer of the maximum security prison from the new Bilibid prison to Sablayan Occidental Mindoro, the medium security to Tanay Rizal, and the minimum security to Fort Magsaysay, Nueva Ecija. The Department of Justice is working closely with the Department of Interior and Local Government and the Supreme Court through the Justice Sector Coordinating Council, a mechanism for effective coordination and sharing of information, planning, and implementation of joint initiatives and judicial reform. We are reinforcing the cooperation and coordination of the prosecution and law enforcement. Proactive case build-up will ensure the quality of cases that reach the courts, thereby increasing the chances of success in the prosecution and ensuring certainty of punishment. Truly, the best recipe in the deterrence against criminality. The review panel created by the Department of Justice to examine incidents during the government's anti-illegal drug campaign continues its important work. Recently, at least 7 incidents involving deaths were filed before the courts, for which 25 police officers have been indicted. A total of 302 cases have been referred by the review panel to the National Bureau of Investigation for case build-up. The Philippine National Police conducted its own investigation of 17,000 officers, in which 27 were dismissed from the service, 18 were demoted, and 98 suspended. Criminal charges were also filed. 9 additional cases will be filed with the Administrative Order 35 mechanism that looks into allegations of extrajudicial killings. This is a fruit of enhanced, secure, and open dialogue I have personally made with civil society leaders who previously did not wish to come forward. With the recent discovery of 176 unclaimed and abandoned cadavers of persons deprived of liberty at the accredited funeral home of our National Bilibid prison, I directed the conduct of an inventory and medical legal investigation. This is to determine the causes of their deaths with the end view of making legally accountable those found responsible for these mysterious deaths. As you can see, the government does not hesitate to take action when there is compelling evidence to do so. We will leave no one behind. Hence, we continue to invite CSOs, witnesses, and families of victims to come forward and provide information and file appropriate cases. We will provide support and security to witnesses under the Witness Protection Program so that fear will not impede in the administration of justice. This is the essence of the community pillar in our criminal justice system. We will dispel the mistaken notion that there is a culture of impunity in our country. We will not tolerate the denial of justice nor any violation of human rights. President Marcos, consistent with the whole-of-nation approach, outlined an expansive government and development program focusing on agriculture, agrarian reform, health, education, infrastructure, energy, social welfare and development, overseas employment, and climate change impacts. Sound fiscal management and reforms in taxation were initiated to ensure that all Filipinos have equal access to food, adequate housing, work, health, education, and a healthy environment. Investments to promote and maintain economic, social, and cultural rights include the following: $138 billion US dollars to the Department of Agriculture as subsidy for millions of farmers, $132.4 million for the Department of Social Welfare and Development for 4 million cash transfer beneficiaries, including people in crisis situations and for the COVID pandemic, and for 153,000 emergency shelters for typhoon victims. $10 million for the Department of Labor and Employment to assist 16,526 victims of the earthquake in northern Luzon and 74,000 victims of Super Typhoon Noru in July and September of this year, respectively. $9.12 million for the Department of Health's Cancer Assistance Fund to extend financial help to needy cancer patients. $15.95 million for the Department of Education as cash support for 925,000 teachers. And $4.3 million for the Department of Environment and Natural Resources for the cleanup and rehabilitation of polluted river systems in Luzon. As a testimony of our advocacy for human rights and welfare of migrant workers, the government established this year a dedicated department for migrant workers, separate and distinct from the existing Department of Labor and Employment. The Philippines remains committed to fighting trafficking in persons, especially women and children. Our Tier 1 status recognizes the efforts of the Interagency Council Against Trafficking. With the recent signing of the Online Anti-Sexual Abuse and Exploitation of Children Act, or OSAIC, greater protection would be granted to vulnerable children in our country. Consistent with our treaty obligations under the UN conventions, we continue to protect refugees, stateless persons, and persons of concern. The Philippines hosts Rohingya refugees and provides them with free tertiary education under the Complementary Pathway Program. We continue to actively consider and discuss with partners such as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the United States possible means to temporarily host other persons at risk. Madam Vice President, our engagement in the UPR is in consonance with our commitment to sustain active, open, and constructive dialogue with the international community and relevant UN mechanisms on human rights. In this spirit, our national report for this fourth cycle was prepared through inclusive consultations with decision makers and stakeholders, including civil society. Careful review was undertaken on the recommendations arising from the last cycle. To that end, considering our system of government consists of 3 independent and co-equal branches of government, we from the executive branch consulted with the representatives from the legislature and the Supreme Court. It is very important to understand our compliance with the recommendations in the context of our system of government and our cultural beliefs and national identity. Of the total 257 recommendations received, 103 were accepted, fully supported, and implemented by the Philippines. These accepted recommendations focus on the following areas: scope of international obligations and cooperation with human rights mechanisms, national human rights framework, right to development, environment, human rights and counterterrorism, right to life, liberty, and security of persons, administration of justice, including impunity and the rule of law, prohibition of all forms of slavery, right to privacy and family life, right to work to just and favorable conditions of work, right to social security, right to adequate standard of living, right to health, right to education, sector rights involving women, children, and persons with disability, migrants, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, and stateless persons. The Philippines noted 154 recommendations, as 99 of which required processes that go beyond the control of our branch of government. The Philippine government, nonetheless, will make best efforts to implement these recommendations, taking into account our national, cultural, and historical circumstances and constraints. Sadly, some of these recommendations appear to insinuate, advertently or inadvertently, that the state has not taken action on any concern raised. This despite our submission of our national report and during the interactive dialogues. For instance, the issue of the death penalty and the lowering of the age of criminal responsibility were sufficiently addressed during the interactive dialogue and subject of deliberations in our legislature. The Philippines did not support 55 recommendations since they seem to be too sweeping, vague, or even contradictory. Ours is a vibrant and active democracy among the freest in the world. Nonetheless, some of these recommendations may merit future consideration by our government. In the period covering the review cycle, the Philippines served its fourth and fifth terms in the UN Human Rights Council, championing reforms in human rights. The Philippines has existing national accountability mechanisms and has endeavored to improve data collection, set up a national mechanism for implementation, reporting, and follow-up of recommendations from the UN human rights mechanisms. It is also pursuing a human rights-based illegal drug control program and human rights-based approach to counter-terrorism, as well as further empowering a free and inclusive civic space. The UN Joint Program on Human Rights supports these existing mechanisms. The Philippines went through 2 enhanced interactive dialogues with this Council, both of which focused on the progress made by the Philippines in the UN Joint Program. President Marcos described the program of the UN General Assembly as, I quote, an example of constructive approach that puts our people, not our politics, at the center of its work. It provides a model for revitalizing the structures that facilitate solidarity between the United Nations and a sovereign duty bearer, unquote. To date, as state party to 8 core international human rights treaties, we have submitted 5 compliance reports and went through 4 constructive dialogues with treaty bodies. We concluded a constructive dialogue with the UN Human Rights Committee last month. And a month before that, we had one with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. We have continually engaged with UN special procedures and mandate holders on human rights of relevance to the country. We initiated the best practice of one-on-one meetings with UN special rapporteurs on the sidelines of the Human Rights Commission sessions. We have had 31 such meetings since 2019. It was through these engagements that we finalized the visit this month of the Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children. The Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression is scheduled to visit in 2023. We have also engaged the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions for training on the Minnesota Protocol. The Philippines' vast civic space is home to over 101,000 non-profit organizations, of which 60,000 are NGOs actively engaged in advocacy work. In the last 3 years, hundreds of hitherto silent and unheard-of human rights organizations have made their presence felt under 3 major activities spearheaded by the state. These are Mga Tingog sa Yutang Kabilin, or Voices from the Ancestral Domains, in August 2020, Ugnayan Bayan, or National Engagement, from November to December 2020, and the first Philippine Human Rights Defenders National Assembly in December 2021. Ambassadors and UN officials of foreign missions, UN Special Rapporteurs, and UN country team officials witnessed and or acted as resource persons in these events. Many states may be challenged by a human rights environment continually being used as a political tool by its critics. But we take this as the price we pay for a democratic system of government that continuously enables and empowers its civic space. At our recent interactive dialogue with the Human Rights Committee, I made a strong call for state actors to abide by their role as human rights defenders. In the context of being duty bearers, the state arrogates upon itself a major duty to defend the rights of its citizens. Civil society groups in the Philippines have lengthily discussed this matter with us, specifically referring to UN Fact Sheet number 29, which cites a significant provision that defines a human rights defender as one who does not advocate hate or violence. Unfortunately, this discussion was not reflected in the summary of proceedings of the Human Rights Committee. I can only surmise that a much larger venue, such as the UPR, is ultimately where I can reiterate this louder call. State actors are also human rights defenders. Nevertheless, as in other free societies, the Philippines shall continue to provide accessible and welcoming venues for active and meaningful dialogue with and among CSOs and human rights defenders. In closing, we trust this UPR will take into account the national, cultural, and social context of our country's compliance with its human rights obligations. Our commitment to human rights was and continues to be anchored on real justice in real time. Our delegation is now ready for comments and recommendations from member states, and will respond to them accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this statement. And we shall now begin our interactive dialogue. But before giving the floor to delegations for their questions and comments, I would like to remind you that the speaking time will be 1 minute and 5 seconds for all. I wish to reiterate that issues of a political, bilateral and territorial nature should be kept out of our deliberations, and United Nations terminology should be used when referring to states and territories. Please be reminded that only the use of the word recommend or recommendation will ensure that the relevant parts of your statements are included in the recommendation section of the working group report. And I will now refer to the list of speakers, and I have the honor to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay. Uruguay, you have the floor.
Thank you. We welcome the delegation of the Philippines and thank them for presenting their report. We recognize the efforts made, including in responding to the adverse effects of climate change. We recommend, 1, revising the existing legal restrictions to guarantee a safe space for journalists and human rights defenders to carry out their work freely and safely, free from intimidation and reprisals. 2, step up commitments to the universal human rights system through the presentation of an open invitation to the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. And in following up a recommendation of the 3rd cycle, we recommend that the Philippines strengthen their commitment to abolishing the death penalty, renouncing the existing legislative efforts to reintroduce it, including on drugs, in order to follow up the obligations of the state as party to the 2nd OP of the CCPR. We wish every success in this review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Uzbekistan welcomes the delegation of Philippines and thanks for submitting the national report at the 4th cycle of UPR. We commend the government of Philippines for its strong efforts and progress in protecting and promoting human rights through various measures outlined in the national report. We also note with appreciation the adoption of law aimed at promotion and protection of rights of and the welfare of migrant workers. In the spirit of constructive cooperation, Uzbekistan recommends the following to Philippines: continue efforts for effectively implementing the national laws and policy measures aimed at ensuring gender equality and women's empowerment. 2, take measures in updating the National Human Rights Action Plan aimed at strengthening national human rights institutions. We wish Philippines all the success in its review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Vanuatu.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Vanuatu welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to this review and thanks them for the insightful presentation. In a spirit of open and constructive dialogue, Vanuatu wishes to make the following recommendations to the Philippines. 1. Strengthens the government's commitment to take ambitious action to address climate change by implementing more inclusive and accessible disaster risk reduction strategies, in particular to protect vulnerable people, to continue to strengthen programs and policies to ensure equitable access to food and safe drinking water, with special attention to people with disabilities. And 3, improve the protection and promotion of the rights of the human rights defenders. Vanuatu wishes the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Venezuela.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of Philippines. We recognise the importance that the country attaches to the UPR and its commitment to promoting and protecting human rights. The Philippines provides a space for over 100,000 non-profit organisations, of which over 60,000 are social or non-governmental organisations. We welcome the Philippines Development Plan to 2022, designed for inclusive development and to protect and promote human rights, particularly in the most vulnerable parts of the population. We recommend continue to make progress on implementing the successful national policies to address climate change in line with its national priorities and objectives for development. Continue to focus on poverty alleviation through investment in the successful programs to combat inequalities and social exclusion, and to continue strengthening its commitment to the promotion and protection of the human rights and well-being of migrant workers. We wish every success. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Vietnam Ambassador.
Madam Vice President, Vietnam commends the Philippines' efforts and progress made since the last UPR and its constructive engagement with the UPR and other human rights mechanisms. Vietnam recommends that the Philippines, 1. better mitigate the social and economic difficulties caused by the COVID-19 pandemic on at-risk groups such as women, children, and persons with disabilities. 2. Improve the preparedness and response of the government in light of climate change-induced disasters and extreme weather events to minimize the loss of lives, livelihoods, and properties. 3. Enhance measures to address structural challenges relating to income equality and poverty affecting the most vulnerable populations and communities in geographically isolated areas. 4. Continue to enhance laws and policies regarding access to education for the most disadvantaged learners. Finally, we wish the Philippines every success with this UPR cycle. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Yemen.
Thank you very much, Madam. We would like to welcome the delegation of the friendly country of the Philippines, and we congratulate them on the detailed presentation which noted the achievements of the government in human rights. The government has indeed implemented the third plan for human rights and is continuing to implement the 2017-2022 plan to promote human rights, and plans have also been developed to ensure developments in local communities such as the Social Security law and the law on public services of 2022. We laud these efforts and call for continued efforts by the government to meet the objectives of economic and social development and improve the human rights situation and the situation of public rights in the Philippines. And we wish every success to the delegation within the UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Algeria.
Madam Vice President, Algeria warmly welcomes distinguished delegation of the Philippines to the 41st session of the UPR. We thank the delegation for the comprehensive presentation of her country reports. Algeria notes the Philippines' human rights-based approach to drug control and welcomes the government's commitment to further bolster the same, including through the United Nations Joint Program on Human Rights. In a spirit of constructive dialogue and engagement, we would like to make the following recommendations. pursue efforts to promote inclusive access to quality education through the implementation of the Basic Education Development Plan 2022. Second, continue enhancing social protection programs pursuant to the Magna Carta of the Poor of 2021. We wish the Philippines every success in her endeavors in the promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Angola. Can you restart the video, please? We don't have...
authorities for... Thank you, Mr. President. Angola welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to this UPR session. Angola takes note of the full implementation of all 1 or 3 accepted recommendations and commends national authorities for carrying out its development plan 2017-2022 in an inclusive and sustainable perspective. Angola commends the Philippines' accession to 1961 Convention on Reduction of Statelessness. Furthermore, recognize its strong commitment to eliminate discrimination and violence against women, as well as to improve the right to education through the Basic Education Development Plan and its substantive budget allocation. Angola presents the following recommendations: to continue to respect its international obligations in accordance with 35 international human rights instruments, to pursue the scale-up birth, civil registration, and citizenship identification of communities at risk of statelessness. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Argentina.
Señora Vicepresidenta.
Madam Vice President, we welcome the signing of the strategic plan in June 2021 between the Philippines Armed Forces and the UN to prevent and combat gross violations of the rights of children in armed conflict. We recommend to the Philippines, 1, adopt the necessary measures to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearance. 2, revise the legislation and the legal framework for the campaign against illegal drugs carried out by the armed forces and security forces to guarantee that it is carried out in conformity with international human rights law. 3, make progress on the creation of a legislative framework and public policies so that all persons, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity, can have access to health, education, work, social security, free from discrimination and violence. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Armenia.
Madam Vice President, Armenia welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and thanks for the presentation of national report. We welcome the Special Protection of Children in Situation of Armed Conflicts Act of 2019, which provides punishment of grave child rights violations in armed conflict situations and acts of gender violence against children. We know the efforts of the Philippines to improve access to justice for vulnerable sectors, in particular persons with disabilities. Armenia recommends the Philippines, 1, to maintain the abolition of death penalty in line with this obligation under the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 2, to finalize the ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Child. 3, to take further steps to eliminate the sexual abuse and exploitation perpetrated against children. We wish the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Australia. Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, and thank you to Secretary Ramallah for his presentation. Australia welcomes actions and commitments taken on human rights by the Philippines since its last UPR, including the Philippines' willingness to engage with the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights. Australia recommends that the Philippines investigate all allegations of extrajudicial killings and ensure accountability, including through continued engagement with the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights. 2, take all necessary measures to ensure full and meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in development and protect defenders of Indigenous peoples' human rights from harassment and intimidation. 3, strengthen the fiscal independence and resourcing of the Commission on Human Rights consistent with the Paris Principles. And 4, ensure laws and policies are consistent with the right to freedom of expression, including by amending laws such as the Cybercrime Prevention Act of 2012 and the revised Penal Code. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Austria.
Thank you. Austria welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and thanks them for the presentation. We commend the government for its efforts in the implementation of recommendations received during the last review. We remain, however, deeply concerned about the intimidation and harassment of civil society activists or the widespread and grave human rights violations in connection to the so-called war on drugs, mainly among the urban poor, including children. Despite constitutional guarantees on freedom of speech and media freedom, provisions of the Cybercrime Prevention Act and decriminalisation of the libel restrict the freedom of expression. Austria regrets the withdrawal of the Philippines from the Rome Statute of the ICC. We offer the following recommendations. 1. Ensure the signing into law of the Human Rights Defenders Protection Bill. 2. Amend the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 to conform with international human rights standards. 3. Provide concrete support for children neglected as a result of their parents' detention or death due to the war on drugs, as well as adequate compensation for victims. 4. Re-accede to the Rome Statute of the ICC. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Azerbaijan.
Madam Vice President, we welcome the delegation of Philippines and thanks for the presentation of its national report. Successful implementation of the Philippine Development Plan 2017-2022, including through enacting relevant legislative acts, is commendable. We also positively note the policies and strategies by the government aimed at addressing unemployment and improving competitiveness in human resources, such as National Employment Recovery Strategy 2021-2022. While appreciating Philippines' commitment to the UPR process, Azerbaijan offers the following recommendations. 1. Continue implementation of policies and strategies for improving access to justice for all. 2. Strengthen the measures ensuring access by vulnerable groups to education, as well as efforts to increase enrollment of children in educational institutions. Azerbaijan wishes Philippines a successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Bahrain.
Vice President, on behalf of my delegation, I am pleased to welcome the delegation of the Philippines. We would like to express our thanks and appreciation for the extensive presentation made to our distinguished council on the 4th UPR report, in which it is clearly shown that the Philippines have demonstrated visible and sincere efforts in focusing on both the promotion and protection of all human rights. My delegation commends the firm constitutional commitment of the Philippines to human rights through the vast radical reforms that have affected the various national courses of action. And we highly appreciate the great gains and tangible achievements that have been made through the continuous efforts and collaboration between the Kingdom of Bahrain and the Philippines in the eradication of human trafficking, and in the advancement in the fields of human rights, economic, and social development. In this context, my delegation makes the following recommendations. Continue the efforts in implementing the new development models aimed at further promoting economic and social development. Continue its efforts to strengthen human rights, particularly within the framework of migrant workers and women's rights. Finally, the delegation of Bahrain wishes the Philippines a successful UPR review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Bangladesh.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Bangladesh warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of the Philippines and acknowledges its new initiatives to advance human rights in challenging circumstances. Philippines' proactive role in dealing with international migration is commendable. We recognize the persistent efforts of the Philippines in addressing trafficking in persons online and offline, and in addressing needs of internally displaced persons. In the spirit of cooperation, Bangladesh offers the following recommendations to Philippines. 1. Pursue effective measures to reduce maternal mortality and protect adolescent girls, as well as to force sterilization of women. And 2, continue its efforts in addressing the negative impacts of climate change on the effective enjoyment of human rights. We wish Philippines every success in its review. I thank you, Madam.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Belarus.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. We welcome the distinguished delegation of the Philippines and thank them for submitting their national report. We note the achievements of the government in providing universal access to vaccination and work to eliminate poverty and expand access to education. We laud the efforts and results of the government in combating human trafficking. We make the following recommendations. Take further steps to improve the level of well-being and social protection of the population, and continue to implement measures to combat trafficking in human beings, including by improving law enforcement practices with a view to bring to justice and punish the perpetrators, as well as by providing victims of trafficking with protection and rehabilitation. Thank you, and we wish you every success.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Belgium.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. While Belgium congratulates the Philippines for the adoption of its first national action plan on the safety of journalists and the adoption of the anti-child marriage law and the anti-online sexual abuse and exploitation of children law, we would like to recommend the Philippines to 1. Hold accountable all perpetrators of violations against journalists, human rights defenders and citizens expressing their freedom of expression, and strengthening the laws protecting journalists and human rights defenders against attacks, threats and killings. 2. Intensify efforts in passing a comprehensive anti-discrimination law that protects all persons from all forms of discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression and sexual characteristics in all settings. And 3. Take all the necessary measures to ensure the effective implementation of the anti-child marriage law and the anti-online sexual abuse and exploitation of children law. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Bhutan.
Bhutan welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to the 4th UPR cycle and thanks the delegation for their comprehensive report. We note with appreciation the significant progress achieved since its last review. We commend the Philippines for its efforts in implementing its human rights obligations, such as through the establishment of the National Mechanism for Reporting and Follow-up and the National Recommendation Tracking Database. We welcome the steps taken to promote the right to education, such as through the adoption of the Basic Education Development Plan 2030 that establishes long-term priorities. We also welcome the allocation of the highest national budget to the education sector. In the spirit of friendship, Bhutan recommends the following. 1. To further strengthen the human rights mechanism through capacity building, and 2. To implement the education development plan effectively. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you. Brazil welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to the 4th cycle of the UPR. With a spirit of constructive dialogue, Brazil recommends the Philippines to develop additional policies to protect women against all forms of gender-based violence, especially women and girls with disabilities, and to ratify the optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. Brazil acknowledged with appreciation the imminent visits of the Special Rapporteurs on the sale and sexual exploitation of children and on freedom of opinion and expression to the country. We commend the Philippines for the creation of the Department of Migrant Workers, as well as for the adoption of the Philippine HIV and AIDS Policy Act. We encourage the country to adopt additional measures to conduct prompt, impartial, thorough, transparent investigations into extrajudicial executions, as well as to strengthen the Interagency Committee on that matter. We wish the Philippines a very successful review.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Brunei.
Madam Vice President, Brunei warmly welcomes the Honorable Jesus Remula, Secretary of Justice of the Philippines and delegation, and we thank them for the presentation of their national report. We recognize the positive steps taken by the Philippines in implementing recommendations from its previous UPR cycle. In addition, Brunei commends the introduction of laws and plans to further enhance development and protect as well as promote human rights, including the Universal Access to Quality Tertiary Education Act, Basic Education Development Plan 2022, and the Universal Health Care Act of 2019. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Brunei proposes 2 recommendations. 1, strengthen efforts to promote inclusive access to quality education, particularly on greater access to higher education for persons with disabilities, and 2, further enhance programs on universal access to healthcare, including support services on mental health and well-being. Madam Vice President, we wish the Philippines a successful conclusion of its review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Bulgaria.
Madam Vice President, Bulgaria welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and thanks for the presentation of the national report. Bulgaria acknowledges the government's commitment to cooperate with the human rights mechanisms, including through the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights. While recognizing that many of the major human rights challenges are long-standing and structural, we know that the human rights situation remains of concern. Bulgaria would like to offer the following 3 recommendations. Review laws and policies to better promote women and girls' empowerment and take additional measures to increase the representation of women in decision-making positions at all levels of the legislative, executive and judicial branches. Develop a comprehensive strategy for preventing and combating all forms of violence against children.
develop a national action plan for inclusive education, and ensure that all children with disabilities have access to education in mainstream schools. We wish the delegation of the Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Burkina Faso.
Thank you. Burkina Faso welcomes the Philippine delegation and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. We note with satisfaction the progress made by the Philippines in implementing the recommendations agreed to in 2017, in particular the adoption by the Philippine government of the National Action Plan 2017-22, aiming to put an end to violence against children, as well as the 2021 law which criminalizes child marriage. We encourage the Philippines to continue these efforts in order to ensure greater effectiveness of better protect the rights of vulnerable groups. In a constructive spirit, we recommend 1, to adopt a global strategy and action plan to promote and protect the rights of children with disabilities, and 2, to elaborate a strategy to protect women, in particular the poorest women, against all forms of violence. We wish the Philippines a very successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Burundi.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. The delegation of Burundi welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and thanks it for the recommendations it has agreed to. My country notes with interest that the Philippines has worked to protect human rights and make it a priority both on a national and international basis. In addition to protecting the rights of women and children, the policy adopted to ensure access to justice for vulnerable people and to combat drugs and poverty is noted with satisfaction. We recommend to the Philippines to continue its efforts to take specific measures to favor access to education, health services, and employment for all, and continue its policy for indigenous people and access to justice of vulnerable groups. We wish the delegation of the Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Cambodia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Cambodia welcomes a free and orderly electoral process held in May 2022 with the highest voter turnout in the history of the Philippines. We commend recent initiatives taken by the government of the Republic of the Philippines in promoting and protecting human rights, including the well-being of its people, through adoption of policies in the area of education, climate change, and energy. In the constructive spirit, Cambodia recommends the following. 1. Continue taking additional action to further expand access to quality education by groups in disadvantaged situations and ensure inclusive, equitable, quality education service. 2. Continue its effort to implement effective disaster risk reduction measures to protect people living in rural areas, especially indigenous communities and most vulnerable groups. Finally, I wish the delegation of the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Canada.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Canada welcomes the Philippines' participation in the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights and its adoption of legislation including ending child marriage, raising the age of consent, and combating online sexual abuse and exploitation of children. We encourage their full and immediate implementation. Canada recommends that the Philippines, 1, ensure the victims of the war on drugs have access to justice by investigating and prosecuting alleged illegal acts committed by law enforcement officials and swiftly concluding associated trial proceedings. 2, enact legislation to better protect human rights defenders, including environmental and indigenous human rights defenders. 3, take appropriate action to amend the revised Penal Code and the Cybercrime Prevention Act in order to decriminalize libel and cyber libel in favor of civil proceedings. And 4, ensure public transport is designed to accommodate persons with disabilities and that children with disabilities are provided adequate transportation to school, and further ensure that the Republic Act 7277 or the Magna Carta for Disabled Persons receives adequate funding. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Chile.
Thank you, Vice President. We welcome the delegation of the Philippines and thank it for presenting the report. We welcome the social opening to the LGBTI community and the protection of persons regardless of sexual orientation in education, women's rights and other regional and municipal initiatives. We also commend the political and economic participation by women. Our delegation recommends 1. Ratifying the Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearance. 2. Starting independent, impartial, effective investigations on summary executions and practices such as physical and psychological torture in the anti-drugs war. And 3, repeal laws that undermine the rights of trans persons. We wish every success in this UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to China.
Madam Vice President, the Chinese delegation appreciates Philippines' constructive engagement with the UPR process and welcomes its achievements in promoting and protecting human rights. Philippines has actively promoted social and economic development, increased employment, developed education and health, and tackled climate change. It has also combated human trafficking and protected women, children, and persons with disabilities and senior citizens' rights. China would like to make the 3 following recommendations. First, push ahead with the sustainable development of its economy and society to provide a solid foundation for its people to enjoy all human rights. Second, further improve people's living conditions and enhance social security system. Third, invest more in health and further build health infrastructures in rural areas. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Costa Rica.
Gracias, Thank you, Vice President. We thank Philippines for presenting its report and recommend 1, not returning to the death penalty, 2, adopting measures to end summary executions and enforced disappearance, as well as illegal detention and torture carried out by the security forces or paramilitaries, step up efforts to combat climate change, including more financing, stop deforestation, and ensure free, prior, informed consent of indigenous peoples in mining. 4, Rome Statute of the ICC. 5, an open invitation to the special procedures. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Côte d'Ivoire.
Thank you very much, Madam. Côte d'Ivoire warmly welcomes the Philippine delegation and thanks it for the presentation of its 4th national report within the framework of the Universal Periodic Review. The Ivorian delegation congratulates the Philippine authorities for the measures taken in implementing the recommendations that had been agreed during the previous UPR review, as well as for their cooperation with UN mechanisms for the protection and promotion of human rights. Côte d'Ivoire in particular welcomes the signing between the armed forces and the United Nations of a strategic plan to prevent and combat serious violations of the rights of children in armed conflicts. While encouraging the Philippine government to continue its efforts, our delegation would like, in a constructive spirit, to make the following recommendations. 1, adopt a global strategy to prevent the multiple forms of discrimination against persons with disabilities, and 2nd, take the necessary measures to establish a national mechanism to prevent torture. In conclusion, we wish every success to the Philippines within the framework of this review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Croatia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Croatia welcomes the delegation of Philippines and thanks them for their presentation. We welcome the government's readiness to cooperate with the UN human rights mechanisms, including through the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights, but regret the programme's slow implementation. We call on the government to step up its efforts to achieve accountability for human rights violations. We have 3 recommendations. 1, effectively engage with the UN Joint Programme, including by ensuring monitoring and transparency of its implementation. 2, ensure independent, full and transparent investigations to prosecute all perpetrators of serious crimes and achieve accountability for human rights violations. 3, re-examined the Mining Act of 1995 with a view to improve environmental provisions and sustainable development practices. We wish the delegation of Philippines a successful review session. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Cuba, Ambassador.
Thank you, Vice President. We warmly welcome the delegation of Philippines and note its commitment to the UPR. We recommend one, continuing progress on full implementation of the third national plan on human rights in order that this continues to be the framework for promoting and protecting human rights. 2, continue national efforts against illegal drugs trafficking with a focus on prevention, education, rehabilitation, and support to victims. We recognize the efforts and the progress made in the country in implementing the recommendations accepted in previous cycles of the UPR and wish every success to the Philippines in this fourth cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Cyprus.
Madam Vice President, Cyprus welcomes the participation of the Filipino delegation and the presentation of its national report. Cyprus recognises the progress made by the Philippines since its last UPR by furthering the rights of women and children, combating human trafficking, efforts to ensuring food security and proper nutrition, as well as the adoption of the Universal Healthcare Law in 2019. In parallel, our delegation wishes to encourage the Philippines to refrain from lowering the minimum age of criminal responsibility, from reinstating the death penalty, and to reconsider its decision to withdraw from the Rome Statute of the ICC. Cyprus has the following recommendations. Ratify the optional protocol to the ICESCR. Conduct back-to-school campaigns and advocacy for education in coordination with local councils for the protection of children. And enforce and enhance legal provisions combating discrimination against women and girls. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Czechia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Czech Republic welcomes the delegation of the Philippines. We took note of the government's commitment to cooperate with UN human rights mechanisms, including through the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights. In the previous UPR cycle, we presented recommendations that were only noted. During this cycle, we offer again the following recommendation. Undertake an independent investigation of the extrajudicial killings related to the fight against illegal drugs and ensure accountability for perpetrators, as well as justice, remedy, and reparations for victims and their families. We also offer the following new recommendations. Cease all attempts to curtail media freedom by inter alia effectively investigating deaths, threats, and harassment of journalists. Impose an emergency moratorium on climate risk projects. Introduce a comprehensive anti-discrimination law which protects all persons from discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We wish the Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The DPRK delegation warmly welcomes delegation in Philippines and notes with appreciation its fourth national report to the UPR. We commend the government of the Philippines for its efforts and progress in the promotion and protection of human rights through Philippines Development Plan 2017-2022, despite unprecedented challenges. My delegation wishes the government of the Philippines greater success in its future endeavor for the promotion and protection of human rights. In the spirit of constructive cooperation, we have two recommendations. 1, continue its effort to fulfill national plan and program towards inclusive development and enhance the protection and promotion of human rights, especially that of most vulnerable sector of society. 2, continue its efforts for maintaining access and delivery of public education for all as a priority of the Philippines. We wish the Philippines the great with the successful review. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to Denmark.
Madam Vice President, Denmark warmly welcomes the delegation of the Philippines. Denmark commends the Philippines' continued efforts to undertake measures towards fully implementing the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act from 1997. Denmark recommends the government to fully and comprehensively implement the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act and ensure full respect for the principle of free, prior and informed consent and meaningful participation at all stages of development projects that affects indigenous peoples. The Committee on the Rights of Peoples with Disabilities have expressed concern about the high levels of gender-based violence against women and girls with disabilities, including sexual violence and abuse. Denmark recommends the Philippines to develop a strategy to protect women and girls with disabilities against all forms of gender-based violence. Finally, Denmark recommends the government to ratify the Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. Denmark wishes the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Djibouti.
Madam Vice President, Djibouti welcomes the high-level delegation of the Philippines and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. My delegation welcomes the efforts undertaken by the Philippine authorities to promote human rights in terms of plans, strategies, and legislation, in particular establishing measures to protect the rights of children, women, migrants, and persons with disabilities. Djibouti would like to make the following recommendations. First, consider ratifying the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And second, continue harmonizing legislation, bringing it into line with international conventions ratified in the field of human rights. And finally, we wish every success to the Philippines in its review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Ecuador.
Señora Vicepresidenta.
Madam Vice President, Ecuador warmly welcomes the Minister for Justice and delegation of the Philippines and thanks them for presenting the report, noting the adoption of the law on migrant workers. In a constructive spirit, we recommend 1. Promote public policies to protect and promote the rights of persons with disabilities and prevent discrimination against women and girls with disabilities. 2. Step up efforts to address trafficking in persons, particularly trafficking, abuse and sexual exploitation of minors online. 3. Adopt tangible measures to establish a national torture prevention mechanism. 4. Implement effective measures for the protection of internally displaced persons with a human rights-based approach and noting the gender perspective. We wish the Philippines delegation every success in the UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Egypt.
شكرا السيدة نائب الرئيس.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Our delegation notes with satisfaction the cooperation between the government of the Philippines and human rights mechanisms and its commitment to submitting reports to the review and its success in holding fair, free elections in 2022. In a spirit of constructive dialogue, we would make the following recommendations. 1, continue initiatives designed to dealing with prison overpopulation, and 2, continue efforts to raise awareness to the negative effects of climate change on human rights, and 3, renew efforts to promote full enjoyment by migrant workers of proper living standards. We wish every success to the delegation of the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Estonia.
Estonia commends the Philippines on the reform on an adequate standard of living and on the progress of rights of women and children. We note with appreciation the progress made on reducing child labor and enforcing the prohibition of slavery and trafficking in persons. In line with our previous recommendations, Estonia would like to recommend to the Philippines to ensure accountability for all the crimes, including enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, illegal arrests and detentions and torture committed in the connection with the so-called war on drugs by conducting speedy and fair trials. Ensure remedy and reparations for victims and their families. Fully respect international human rights law in efforts to combat the trade in and use of illegal drugs. Re-ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC. Take all necessary measures to provide adequate protection to lawyers, human rights defenders, journalists and media workers, in particular regarding enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. Estonia wishes the delegation of the Philippines a fruitful review meeting. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Eswatini.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Kingdom of Eswatini warmly welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and welcomes developments made since the last review process, where the country accepted 103 recommendations. We applaud the Philippines for its continued engagement with the OHCHR, special procedures and treaty bodies. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, we recommend to the Philippines: 1. Consider ratifying the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. 2. Continue strengthening laws that improve the well-being of persons living with disability. 3. Further strengthen laws that combat gender-based violence. 4. Further strengthen the Basic Education Development Plan 2030 to ensure that all learners receive quality education. In conclusion, the Kingdom of Eswatini wishes the Republic of the Philippines success in this review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Finland, Ambassador.
Madam Vice President, Finland welcomes the engagement of the Philippines in the UPR process and offers the following recommendations. 1. To enact the Human Rights Defenders Bill and strengthen existing mechanisms to prevent violations against human rights defenders, including holding perpetrators accountable. 2. To pass legislation protecting LGBTIQ+ and other persons in vulnerable positions from all forms of discrimination, notably the Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Gender Expression Equality Bill. 3. To ensure effective implementation of the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act. 4. To investigate thoroughly the deaths, threats and harassment of journalists and ensure that the freedom of press is not restricted by intimidation of the media. Finland wishes the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to France.
Madame la Vice-Présidente.
Madam Vice President, France thanks the Philippine delegation for presenting its report. While the human rights situation inherited from the previous government is still a matter of concern, France encourages the new authorities to implement the following recommendations. 1. Take all necessary measures effectively to combat impunity for perpetrators of summary executions in the context of the anti-drugs war. 2. Make tangible, transparent progress in implementing the technical joint cooperation programme established by Resolution 45/33 of the Human Rights Council. 3. Continue implementation of the measures needed for the permanent eradication of trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and children. 4. Ratify the Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearance. 5. Once more, ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
And I now give the floor to Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Georgia welcomes and thanks the delegation of the Philippines for the presentation of the national report. We positively evaluate the launching of the first national plan of action on the safety of journalists in 2020, elaborated through multi-stakeholder consultations. Georgia values implementation of programs targeting the most vulnerable population groups. We welcome the implementation of the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act of 2012, which resulted in improvements in antenatal and postpartum care and hospital-based deliveries. Georgia would like to recommend to the Philippines to continue measures to address structural challenges relating to income inequalities and poverty, to take further measures to address the issue of trafficking against the women and girls with disabilities. With this in mind, we wish the delegation of the Philippines a very successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Germany.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Germany welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and commends recent steps in protecting child rights by raising the minimum age of sexual consent and defining child marriage as child abuse. Germany also commends the creation of a ministry to protect migrant workers and combat human trafficking. Germany remains highly concerned about the violence and intimidation against human rights defenders, environmental defenders and journalists. Germany recommends to 1. take all necessary measures to prevent extrajudicial killings and enforce disappearance and carry out impartial investigations to hold perpetrators accountable, including through the serious engagement with the UN Joint Programme. 2. Take all necessary measures to protect the life of human rights defenders, journalists, environmental defenders, indigenous peoples and other persons. 3. Ratify the ILO Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples and ensure that laws, policies and programs aimed at protecting the human rights of indigenous peoples are effectively implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ghana welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to the UPR Working Group. We commend the government of Philippines for adopting the National Advocacy and Communication Strategic Plan and the Philippine Development Plan, which intend to enhance the protection and promotion of human rights in the country. We further acknowledge the efforts made to improve access to justice for the vulnerable, including persons with disabilities. To further consolidate democracy and respect for rule of law in the country, Ghana recommends that the Philippines should, 1, provide adequate protection to journalists and human rights defenders to halt the spate of enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. 2, adopt strategies to address overcrowding in detention facilities. 3, hold perpetrators of alleged cases of torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment accountable. And finally, grant unrestricted access to the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions. We wish Philippines a successful UPR outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Greece.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Greece welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to the UPR. We commend the country's efforts to combat human trafficking in the online landscape through the enaction of the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act. And we'd also like to give special mention to the government's launch of the National Action Plan on Fair and Ethical Recruitment, which provided enhanced employment opportunities to people of migrant backgrounds. Greece recommends that the Philippines take urgent measures to address the systematic crackdown of media freedom under the guise of anti-terrorism policies, take immediate action to publicly condemn at the highest levels the use of excessive and disproportionate force by security forces in response to protests, and ensure the existence of efficient accountability mechanisms to bring offenders into justice, and take into account calls for protection of human rights defenders within the country, including conducting immediate and impartial investigations into cases of attacks, harassment, and intimidation of such individuals. We wish Philippines a successful review, and I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Iceland.
Madam Vice President, Iceland welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and its national report. Iceland makes the following recommendations. 1. Cease all attempts to reintroduce the death penalty. 2. Decriminalize abortion and ensure access to safe abortion. 3. Adopt a comprehensive anti-discrimination law that includes the prohibition and prevention of all forms of discrimination against LGBTQI+ persons. 4. Adopt legal provisions that penalize hate crimes against LGBTQI+ persons. 5. End immediately the war on drugs and prioritize a health-based approach to substance abuse and addiction. 6. Implement fully the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights. I wish the Philippines all success for its review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to India.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. India warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Philippines and thanks the delegation for presenting its national report. We commend the delegation of Philippines for the progress made in implementing the recommendations received by them at their last review. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, India recommends the following to Philippines. 1. Continue implementation of measures for reducing inequality, poverty and unemployment rates. 2. Strengthen further efforts in increasing drinking water and sanitation coverage in rural areas. And 3. Continue with measures to ensure access to education for children with disabilities. We wish the delegation of Philippines all success in its review. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Indonesia warmly welcomes the high-level delegations of the Philippines. We commend the Philippines' achievements in implementing the accepted recommendations from the previous UPR and measures to address and eradicate trafficking in persons. In a constructive spirit, Indonesia recommends
1. Continue to take all necessary measures to prevent and combat online child sexual exploitations and abuse. 2. Strengthen measures to alleviate poverty, including by fully implementing the Magna Charta of the Poor 2021 and to further enhance human capital investment and social protection programs. 3. Continue the implementations of law and programs to promote the rights and welfare of migrant workers at the national, regional, and international levels. We wish the Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Iran.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Madam Vice President, Iran welcomes the delegation of Philippines to this review session and thank them for the insightful national report submitted to the working group. We welcome the Enable Civic Space in the Philippines, which allows a broad range of stakeholders to share knowledge and experiences on human rights and conducts a national gathering on promoting and protecting human rights. In a constructive spirit, Iran would like to recommend to Philippines, 1, to continue its efforts to promote the rights of persons with disabilities through policies benefiting the sector. 2, to continue the implementation of the Responsible Parenthood and Productive Health Act, which has resulted in improvement in antenatal and postpartum care and facility-based deliveries. Finally, Iran wishes Philippines the success in implementation of recommendations and its continued cooperation with the UPR process. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يرحب به الجمهور.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation welcomes the delegation of Philippines and welcomes the efforts made to prepare the report. We commend the efforts to promote and protect human rights and the policies to uphold rights, particularly those under the Constitution. We recommend studying ratification of the International Convention to Protect All Persons Against Enforced Disappearance. 2, continuing efforts to draw up a strategic plan to prevent violations of the rights of children in armed conflict, signed between the UN and the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And we wish every success to the Philippines in the EPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Ireland thanks the Philippines for its presentation today. We acknowledge the stated commitment to human rights and openness to dialogue by the new administration. We note engagement to date with the UN Joint Programme and encourage continued support to its full implementation. Ireland remains gravely concerned by reports of continued extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances by government forces. We also regret that since the last UPR, the Philippines has withdrawn from the ICC. We remind the Philippines of its obligation to cooperate with the prosecutors' ongoing investigations into alleged international crimes committed in the Philippines and ensure access to justice for victims and survivors. We are also concerned by reports of impediments to freedom of expression as well as discrimination against LGBTI+ persons. In this regard, Ireland recommends 1. Implement measures to create and maintain a safe and enabling environment for human rights defenders, activists, journalists and other members of civil society, and 2. Adopt the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Expression Equality Act at national and local levels. We wish the Philippines every success in this UPR cycle. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Italy, Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We thank the distinguished delegation of the Philippines for its national report and presentation. Italy recognizes the steps undertaken by the Philippines in order to advance gender equality and women and girls' rights, as well as to prevent and combat discrimination and violence against them, such as the adoption of the 2019 Safe Spaces Act and the 2021 Act criminalizing child marriages. Italy seizes this opportunity to offer the Philippines the following recommendations: ensure a safe and enabling environment for civil society and ensure freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly and media freedom. Ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. Further strengthen the measures to protect the rights of children, prevent and combat all forms of violence and abuse against them. We wish the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Japan warmly welcomes the delegation of Philippines to this session and appreciates the positive steps taken by the Philippines since the previous review cycle. We welcome the ongoing implementation of the Philippine-U.S. Joint Program for Human Rights. We commend the enactment of the Act punishing online sexual abuse or exploitation of children, penalizing production, distribution, possession, and access of child sexual abuse or exploitation materials, and the Act prohibiting the protection of practice of child marriage and imposing penalties or violation thereof. We hope that these measures will be properly implemented and contribute to the protection and promotion of human rights in the Philippines. Japan would like to make following two recommendations. First, develop national action plan in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Second, ratify international convention on the protection of all persons from enforced disappearances. We wish the delegation of the Philippines every success in the review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the delegation of the Philippines to address observations and comments that have been raised so far. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Our delegation is prepared to answer the recommendations given to us by the different nations who are here for this peer review. Let me begin by reading our position on human rights defenders and civic space. The democratic tradition of the Philippines is an enabling environment for human rights defenders to promote their advocacies through participative governance. The cornerstone of this tradition is the human right to suffrage prescribed by Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 25 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. We conduct free and genuine periodic elections, the most recent of which was the national and local elections last May 22. The said elections saw 10 presidential and vice presidential candidates, 64 candidates for senator, 178 party list groups, thousands of citizens vying for 18,000 elective positions. During the campaign, they were all given full access to their human right to participate in public affairs. The May 2022 elections had the highest voter turnout in the history of the Philippines at 83%, or 55,549,791 out of 65,745,512 registered voters. President Marcos garnered 56% of the votes cast, receiving more than 31 million votes. Apart from the right to suffrage, the enabling civic space of the Philippines serves as a welcome platform for 101,000 registered nonprofit organizations. Of these, 60,000 NGOs are engaged in socio-political advocacy work. This is evidence that we have a thriving, vibrant, and highly participative democratic space. In the truest spirit of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders and the UN Fact Sheet number 29, the state engages with human rights defenders to joint activities such as the conduct of the first Human Rights Defenders National Assembly, wherein more than 119 human rights defenders and the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawlor, participated. The Philippine Supreme Court, in numerous decisions, has continually afforded human rights defenders free access to proactive judicial remedies, such as the writ of amparo, the writ of kalikasan, the writ of habeas data, and the writ of habeas corpus, to ensure the protection of rights enshrined in our Constitution, such as the right to life, liberty, security, and privacy. Concern was made by many nation states here about extrajudicial killings, and we intend to address this in many ways. The most important probably is a legislative agenda of restructuring our national police force organizational structure, so that the internal affairs cluster will be given an independence not given right now in our law. This will answer many questions about the EJ case or even the impunity that is being spoken about. This way, the transparency of the processes within the police force will come into light, and this we intend to bring in the next legislative round of the next legislative cycle. President Marcos has set the tone at the top, calling on the Philippine National Police to use force only when necessary and to make sure it is accountable and justifiable. He has refocused on the anti-illegal drug campaign by tackling poverty eradication and by giving priority to rehabilitation, prevention, education, and assistance to victims and their families. On the death penalty, the Philippines remains a pioneering state in Asia for abolishing the capital punishment or the death penalty. Mere discussions or dialogue within and outside the parliament between parliamentarians and their stakeholders does not violate any human rights treaty, as discussions and dialogue regarding the capital punishment or the death penalty are covered under the right to hold opinions, which is protected right in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I can assure everybody here that our President Marcos, is not inclined to restore the death penalty anytime within his term of office, and that he may recommend the abolition of the death penalty in the soonest possible time. There was also a mention about overcrowding of detention facilities, and this we have been addressing properly and directly through the Department of Justice initiatives. We are decongesting the jails, releasing prisoners, and having an infrastructure program to create regional jails so there will be no more overcrowding. And we will be abolishing the biggest mega prison in the world in the National Bilibid Prison in the Philippines. This will be in a matter of 3 to 5 years when we are able to build 15 regional jails that will house jails of PDLs of only the number of only 2,500 or even less per building or per facility. The Commission on Human Rights, also being the most empowered human rights organization in the world, in any country, also conducts jail visits to be able to ensure that our jails are the performance of our jails are improved and that the conditions are met properly. My other colleagues here in the delegation will now answer the other issues brought forward.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. On the access to justice, observance of the rule of law, and access to accountability mechanisms, we respectfully inform this honorable body of the following. State-sponsored accountability mechanisms on the law enforcement pillar of our criminal justice system, based on the rule of law and respect for human rights, are available and accessible. The Department of Justice Review Panel facilitated the filing of cases against 25 policemen involved in drug operations. 9 other drug-related killings are being investigated with the assistance of civil society organizations. The review panel continues its task, and we expect more cases to be filed in due time. The Philippine National Police's Internal Affairs Service conducted motu proprio, or on its own, investigations of 17,500 police officers involved in anti-drug operations that allegedly resulted in fatalities. As a result, 27 officers were dismissed from the service, 18 were demoted, and 98 others were suspended. Law enforcement agencies enforce drug campaign through the use of body-worn cameras or, in their unavailability, alternative recording devices during all overt operations and in the implementation of search and arrest warrants. Currently, the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency has procured 806 units of body-worn cameras of international standards, distributed them to all regional offices and provincial offices for their use. The use of body-worn cameras is governed by the rules promulgated by the Supreme Court. The law also requires the presence of insulating witnesses. These are witnesses who are required to be present during drug buy-bust operations, namely elective barangay officials and representative of the media and/or the Department of Justice. Ladies and gentlemen, this is meant to ensure transparency and accountability in police operations. These state-sponsored efforts are complemented by the strengthening under the leadership of the Department of Justice of the Witness Protection Program. This program is intended to encourage civil society organizations, witnesses, and families of victims or any interested person to come forward and file appropriate cases to ensure accountability of the wrongdoers. This forms part of another pillar in our criminal justice system, which is the community. To ensure that the access to justice would really be effective, and it is intended to realize that justice be served, we at the Department of Justice are implementing measures and pursuing reforms in the prosecution of cases. As an update in another pillar of our criminal justice system, which is the prosecution pillar, we are currently working on the case build-up rules. These rules would cover case build-up, evidence gathering, interview of witnesses, and the like, to secure the likelihood of a reasonable certainty of convictions. The avowed purpose is to prevent frivolous suits and harassment cases, and this is meant to ensure accountability to all criminal activities. The case build-up rules require, among others, a higher threshold in the degree of proof for filing of cases, from mere probable cause to probable cause coupled with reasonable certainty of conviction. The investigating prosecutor must certify such reasonable certainty before filing of cases. Once implemented, these rules we expect to lower the docket of our prosecution service. To complement these rules, we are also crafting a rule on the creation of a prosecution integrity board. This accountability mechanism will continue and improve the existing internal affairs unit of the Department of Justice to ensure transparency and responsibility among our prosecutors. To prevent miscarriage of justice, we are also proposing a rule governing the residual authority of the Secretary of Justice to review overall preliminary investigations at whatever stage upon complaint of a litigant or motu proprio, which is on his own, in the event of certain irregularities. These rules will also result, the case build-up rules, in exponential benefits to the judiciary and the corrections pillar of our criminal justice system, with the requirement that only cases with reasonable certainty of conviction be filed in court. Plainly, the docket of the courts will be lowered substantially. With the reduced case dockets, even with convictions, the number of persons found guilty of crimes and penalized with jail time would be reduced. The congestion of our jail system, at least partially, will definitely be achieved. In other words, these rules will cut through the law enforcement, the prosecution, and the court, plus the corrections pillar. 4 of the 5 pillars of the criminal justice system in the Philippines. The Supreme Court is leading the efforts to review the present criminal law justice and all aspects of our justice system. The avowed purpose, among others, is to increase the threshold for filing of criminal cases from probable cause to prima facie evidence. Interestingly, prima facie evidence is similar to the probable cause plus reasonable certainty of conviction that we at the Department of Justice are proposing in the case build-up rules. Reforms in our judicial system, ladies and gentlemen, are spearheaded by the Supreme Court as the lead convener of the very active and vibrant Justice Sector Coordinating Council. This Justice Sector Coordinating Council is embedded in all areas of our archipelago. And this year alone, we have had 3 dialogues already. One in Cebu, another in Davao, and another in Naga. The 2 co-conveners are the Department of Justice, our department, and the Department of Interior and Local Government. Evidently, the coordinated and cooperative efforts of the 3 branches of government in our system, the Supreme Court, the legislature, and the executive would be the best solution to ensure not only access to justice, but also improve accountability of anybody who will violate the law. Thank you very much.
Your Excellencies, Madam Vice President, addressing the concerns on the vibrancy of the media environment, allow me to state the following. Recognizing Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the state provides for an enabling environment for the right to freedom of opinion and expression. In fact, in the Philippines, there are 1,485 privately owned radio stations and 546 TV stations, all operating within the country. There are also accountability mechanisms in place to protect media. Under Administrative Order Number 1, the Philippines established a state-sponsored mechanism like the Presidential Task Force on Media Security. This is a first of its kind in the world that protects media workers and journalists against harassment and violence against media workers. The inclusive multi-stakeholder task force is composed of the state's National Human Rights Institution, or the Commission on Human Rights, several private non-government organizations, civil society organizations, such as the National Press Club of the Philippines, which is one of the biggest and most reputable organizations of journalists in the Philippines, together with the Publishers Association of the Philippines. Multi-stakeholder partnerships between the state's prosecution service, the Commission on Human Rights, media organizations, civil society, victims and victims' families contributed significantly to the conviction of 44 perpetrators, all masterminds and participants, including high-ranking government officials and policemen who were held accountable for the killing of journalists and human rights defenders in the Ampatuan, Maguindanao massacre case. Addressing the concerns raised by His Excellencies in Austria, Armenia, and Greece on anti-terrorism, let me state that fully noting the recommendations of the UN Human Rights Committee in item number 8 to review the Human Security Act of 2007 and to legislate an amendatory law, the state embarked on inclusive consultations that were true to its multi-sectoral, whole-of-nation, and whole-of-society approach to formulate the Anti-Terrorist Act of 2020. This was legislated with contributions from the state's primary human rights institution, the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, human rights defenders, civil society organizations, and at least 25 vulnerable sectors representing youth, students, teachers, academe, farmers, displaced persons, and indigenous peoples. Engagements between the state and civil society, as well as human rights defenders, led to the adoption of human rights provisions within the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 that serve as good practice templates to protect human rights while countering terrorism and extremist violence. These provisions or sections in the law were on the institutionalization of the state's National Human Rights Institution, the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, which is found in Section 29 of the law, respect for civic space and all forms of peaceful advocacies, found in Section 4, and the protection of vulnerable groups such as pregnant women, elderly, and persons with disabilities, found in Section 51 of the law. 19 sections of the Philippines anti-terror law provide for direct judicial oversight The independent judiciary, through the Supreme Court of the Philippines, remains an accessible institution for any aggrieved party to question the validity of said law. The anti-terror law was designed by human rights defenders, civil society organizations, and the Commission on Human Rights, and this enables the states as human rights duty bearer to rescue disappeared children from extremist violence committed by terror groups within the Philippines. And in fact, at least 400 children have been rescued from such extremist violence and groups within the Philippines. Mr. Secretary.
Madam Vice President, Your Excellencies, please allow me to address the concerns raised on human trafficking or trafficking in persons, particularly by the states of Bahrain and Belarus. Please note that the state retains the highest Tier 1 ranking for 7 consecutive years in the 2022 Global Trafficking in Persons report of the U.S. State Department, indicating that the Philippines has made efforts to address the problem that meet the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2020's minimum standards. Philippines' Tier 1 ranking is realized through the comprehensive, coordinated, and concerted response of the Justice Department-chaired Interagency Council Against Trafficking, or IACAT, its member agencies, and partner organizations. IACAT's efforts against TIP focus on 4 key areas, namely prevention and advocacy, protection, investigation and prosecution, and partnership. On prevention and advocacy, IACAT and the Philippine National Police both maintain mechanisms for reporting of TIP cases through 1343 Action Line and Helpline. A chatbot is likewise being developed to allow migrant workers with access to frequently asked questions and provide access to grievance mechanisms. Awareness and capacity building efforts are sustained through continuous conduct of trainings of barangay and local government officials, prosecutors, law enforcers, including private sector stakeholders. In view of incidents of illegal recruitment and TIP vis-a-vis the opening of borders for international travels, departure formalities for international bound passengers are being revised in order to provide more stringent requirements for international travels. On protection, the state's Department of Social Welfare and Development, or DSWD, oversees and implements the provision of assistance to victim survivors. In 2021, 1,914 victim survivors were provided assistance, 71% of whom are female victims. In 2022, at least 833 victims of forced labor, sexual exploitation, and pornography or online sexual exploitation were assisted. The IACAT has constructed and supervises the Tahanan ng Inyong Pag-asa Center, or TIP Center, which is used for emergency and urgent referrals to provide temporary shelter of trafficked victims, particularly to rescued victims during law enforcement operations. The IACAT is also working on the construction of the Bahay Kanlungan to serve as a temporary shelter or safe house for trafficked persons and persons at risk, especially women and children. The DSWD intensifies the trauma-informed care in all shelters, which focuses on the understanding of the physical, social, and emotional impact of trauma on the individual and connecting them with appropriate professionals. The Victim Witness Coordinators already provided 1,261 different types of assistance to 234 clients in the first half of 2022. The Operations Center, or OPCEN, acts as a support unit to the investigation, prosecution, and protection of victims of trafficking. The Victims' Compensation Program under the Board of Claims provided financial assistance to 21 TIP victims in 2021 and 13 victims from January to June 2022. And finally, the Witness Protection, Security, and Benefit Program of the DOJ continues to provide protection and security assistance, shelter, immunity from criminal prosecution, livelihood assistance, travel expenses, medical benefits, education for dependents, and job security to TIP victims. On investigation and prosecution, the IACAT supports the operation of specialized units and task forces against TIP, namely the Anti-Human Trafficking Division of the National Bureau of Investigation, the Women and Children Protection Center of the Philippine National Police, and the 24 anti-trafficking task forces established around the Philippines, which are composed of prosecutors, law enforcers, social workers, immigration officers, and other officers at the airports and seaports. On partnership and networking, the IACAT maintains effective collaboration with other countries and foreign missions in the Philippines, domestic and foreign or international partner organizations, and other government agencies, including the Philippine judiciary, as it is one of the key strategies in advancing anti-trafficking responses. Finally, in furtherance of the state's efforts against trafficking, especially on children, an important law passed in July this year, Republic Act number 11930, or the Anti-Online Sexual Abuse or Exploitation of Children and Anti-Child Sexual Abuse or Exploitation Materials Act, which expanded the original law on TIP, which was further amended in June of 2022 by Republic Act number 11862, or the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2022, in order to address foremost the growing concern on online sexual abuse and exploitation of children, or OSAIC, and other types of trafficking in persons committed through the use of information and communications technology. This law also increased the IACAT member agencies from 14 to 29. Thank you.
Madam Vice President, Your Excellencies, addressing the various issues relating to extralegal killings, enforced disappearances, and torture. Administrative Order Number 35, or AO 35, created the Interagency Committee, an efficient, coherent, and comprehensive government machinery dedicated to the resolution of grave violation of human rights. All government agencies, including local government units, provide full support, cooperation, and assistance to the IAC in carrying out its mandate. Through a composite team of prosecutors and law enforcement, the AO 35 mechanism investigates and oversees the prosecution of extrajudicial killings committed against political activists, human rights defenders, advocates of labor rights, environmental rights, agrarian rights, indigenous peoples' rights, and other similar causes. It investigates and oversees the prosecution of perpetrators of enforced disappearances and torture. Also, it has intensified efforts to investigate and hold armed groups accountable for violations of Republic Act number 9851, the Philippine domestic law that penalizes crimes against humanity, including the same international crimes established under the Rome Statute. Included in the cases being investigated are the alleged recruitment by armed groups of more than 500 children to participate in the armed conflict. Previously, under AO 35, 28 individuals have been convicted for grave human rights violations. In 2019, to ensure a more effective implementation, enhance collaboration and cooperation between agencies, increase support for victims and witnesses, and improve the outcome of investigations, activities, projects, and programs were undertaken, and the results validated the efforts. Recently, 34 police officers and personnel were charged with murder for the killing of human rights advocates. Complaints arising from other human rights violations are being prepared. Inclusive consultations on the improved functioning of AO 35 are also being undertaken. Only last October, consultations with local government executives, CSO's Negros Human Rights Alliance, Sulong Peace were conducted. Another CSO, the National Union of People's Lawyers, even expressed its pleasure and warmly welcomed the intent to dialogue. There have also been engagements with families of victims, trade unions including Kilusang Mayo Uno and the Federation of Free Workers, and representatives from other CSOs, including those from Karapatan and Bayan Muna. These accomplishments highlight the independence of the judiciary and the effective coordination between the state's prosecution services, victims, civil society organizations, and human rights defenders through the AO 35 mechanism. Thank you.
Madam Vice President, Your Excellencies, on the Philippine Human Rights Plan, the state currently implements the third Philippine Human Rights Plan for 2018 to 2022 in keeping with the 1993 Vienna Convention and Program of Action. The core international treaties to which the state is a party provide a framework for the plan. In 2020, the plan was subjected to a midterm assessment by way of a series of forums that included representatives from 86 government bodies, 41 foreign missions, 73 civil society groups and non-government organizations, and 5 UN agencies that partnered in the process as expert resources. An end-of-term assessment of the plan is scheduled for the first quarter of 2023 in consultation with various stakeholders, including the National Human Rights Institution. This activity will lay the groundwork for the formulation of the fourth Philippine Human Rights Plan for 2023 to 2027. On the National Mechanism for Implementation Reporting and Follow-up, to further strengthen the NMERF, the Presidential Human Rights Committee Secretariat has conducted a series of capacity-building trainings for state agencies in partnership with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights Regional Office for Southeast Asia, leading to the establishment and operation of the National Recommendations Tracking Database. This database will be at the core of the work of the NMERF and shall not only be a repository of human rights-related information necessary for periodic compliance reporting, but shall spur efforts as well as to further the use of human rights-based approaches to development programming and government and to mainstream human rights in the bureaucracy. The ongoing development of the NMERF is part of the UN Joint Program for Human Rights in the Philippines, which is currently being implemented by the state with the UN. On the matter of maternal and neonatal mortality and morbidity, the state ensures the protection of pregnant women during childbirth through the Department of Health's Safe Motherhood Program, which aims to provide women full access to health services for safer pregnancy and delivery. This program has been recently recalibrated to adapt to the new normal by improving the quality of family planning counseling, expanding postpartum family planning in hospitals and birthing facilities, maximizing teleconsulting and teleprescription platforms for antenatal and postpartum care, and conducting online trainings on basic emergency obstetric and newborn care services. On the matter of violence against women and girls, the state continues to intensify efforts to raise awareness on violence against women and girls, with state agencies conducting annual information, education, and communication campaigns by way of printed materials on laws on anti-violence against women and girls that are widely disseminated. Trainings have also been conducted for medical personnel in handling cases of violence against women and girls through the Women and Children Protection Program of the Department of Health. Said program provides technical and management support to ensure that women and child protection units and hospitals are established and operational as mandated by law. Local government monitoring of such violation remains operative to facilitate reporting of cases during the pandemic. The Interagency Council on Violence Against Women and Children, composed of 12 government agencies, reinforced its online information campaign to disseminate hotlines for police assistance, legal consultations, as well as medical and referral services. In addition, the Magna Carta of Women designates the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, the independent National Human Rights Institution, as the Gender Ombud. The Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines has its Gender Ombud guidelines, providing the process in accessing its services, which include investigation, provision of legal assistance, policy advisory, monitoring and promotion of women's human rights, including those of persons with diverse sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. The guidelines has 3 protocols for the gender-sensitive handling of cases that include women and girls with disabilities. On SOGIE-related concerns, the state continues to build a better and more inclusive society and ensures that the welfare and interests of women, men, and members of the LGBTQ community are promoted and protected. Pertinently, Section 1, Article 3 of the Philippine Constitution states that no person shall be denied the equal protection of the law. While the passage of a comprehensive anti-discrimination law remains under consideration, a number of local jurisdictions have enacted anti-discrimination ordinances that include sexual orientation as well as gender identity and expression as among the protected categories. As examples, the local government of Quezon City passed a gender-fair ordinance which bans discrimination against members of the LGBTQ+ community in workplaces, educational institutions, and in the delivery of goods and services. In the city of Manila, Ordinance number 8695 bans gender discrimination in the capital, which covers acts denying or limiting employment opportunities, denying access to establishments, verbal or written insults, and physical and verbal harassment on SOGI. On HIV-related concerns, the state protects the human rights of people living with HIV by undertaking efforts and providing essential services. In 2019, the Philippine government enacted the Philippine HIV and AIDS Policy Act, committing to a multi-sectoral approach to ensure access to prevention and testing programs, as well as investment in treatment, care, and support services for all persons living with HIV. Even with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Philippine government, through the Department of Health and local government units, ensured the continuous provision of effective and accessible delivery of HIV care and support services. On calls for the state to ratify the International Convention on Protection of Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, the state has ratified 8 of the 9 core international human rights treaties and does not see the urgency to ratify this remaining one. The state already has an Anti-Enforced or Involuntary Disappearance Act, which not only criminalizes enforced and involuntary disappearance, but also provides restitution, compensation, and rehabilitation for victims and their families, particularly in relation to incidents or commission of torture, violence, threat, or intimidation, or such other means which vitiate the free will of persons abducted, arrested, detained, disappeared, or otherwise removed from the effective protection of the law. On the ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention on Rights of the Child and the OPCR-PD, similarly, the state sees that while these mechanisms are well-intentioned to provide redress to those whose rights have been violated, it is of the view that it must be accorded the chance to fully implement the various laws it has enacted for the same purpose in recent years, such as the Child and Youth Welfare Code, Special Protection of Children Against Abuse, Exploitation and Discrimination, Anti-Violence Against Women and Children, the Magna Carta of Women, Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act, and the Magna Carta of Persons with Disabilities, among others. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Madam Vice President, on the strengthening on the Commission of Human Rights in the Philippines, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, or GANRI, accredits the Philippines National Human Rights Institution, known as the Commission on Human Rights, an A rating signifying full compliance with the UN Paris Principles or the principles relating to the status of national institutions. State efforts in ensuring compliance with the UN principles has been to engage the CHR in the formulation of human rights policies and institutionalize their mandate within laws, such as the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. Examples of CHR inputs are found in Section 29, ensuring their role in the operation of the anti-terror law. In Section 4, respecting civic space and all forms of peaceful advocacies, including human rights. And in Section 51, protecting vulnerable groups such as pregnant women, elderly, and persons with disabilities. In addition, the CHR is allowed unhampered access to jails to monitor jail conditions and services, and has made a total of 470 documented jail visits that is broken down as follows: 108 visits in 2016, 102 visits in 2017, 155 in 2018, 144 in 2019, and 111 in 2020. Lastly, the CHR is a member of the Administrative Order number 35 on extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances and torture. their participation in the pursuit of accountability for perpetrators in cases involving extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and torture has resulted in 28 convictions in 13 cases, with 1 case convicting an Army general and a colonel. On indigenous peoples, the Philippines legislation for indigenous peoples acknowledges Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights regarding the right for ethnic minorities to enjoy their own culture. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997 eventually became a model for the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. In realizing Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on the right to self-determination with regard to political status and economic, social, and cultural development, the state ensures the participation of 1,180 indigenous peoples organizations, 32 indigenous people structures, and 5,503 indigenous peoples mandatory representatives in local decision-making bodies who are selected by their own indigenous cultural communities to guarantee legitimate indigenous peoples representation and participation in governance. The state also involves indigenous peoples and indigenous cultural communities' activities through the conduct of activities allowing for dialogue, such as activity titled Voices from the Ancestral Domains, Fulfilling Rights, Addressing Challenges, or Indigenous Peoples of the Philippines, which is participated in by hundreds of representatives of indigenous peoples communities engaging with government, partners, UN system officials, including the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, Francisco Calitsay. In efforts to ensure the formal recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples to a native title on their land, ancestral domains, more than 5.7 million hectares of land and water, or about 1/6 of the country, have been duly titled in the name of indigenous peoples, as manifested in their registration of 244 certificates of ancestral domain titles, or CADTIs, benefiting 1,314,000 indigenous peoples' rights holders, as well as in the 249 certificates of ancestral land titles, or CALTIs, that are equivalent to 16,000 hectares, benefiting 7,156 indigenous peoples' rights holders. The free and prior informed consent, or FPIC, is a state-sponsored process for the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples that is facilitated through the state's National Office for Indigenous Peoples, or the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. This process ensures that commercial activities of investors or proponents comply with the requirements of the FPIC process before any project or activity is conducted in ancestral domains. 450 certification of preconditions were issued to proponents who sought to undertake large-scale projects through the FPIC process. On the matter of children and the anti-illegal drugs campaign, the state, in keeping with Article 6 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, recognizing the inherent right to life of the child, has rescued 4,488 children aged 4 to 17 years involved in illegal drugs, either as pushers, possessors, users, as visitors, employees, and maintainers of drug dens, cultivators, runners, and laboratory employees from July 1, 2016 to June 30, 2022. Rescued children are covered by the state's protocol when handling children allegedly involved in dangerous drugs to address the impact of the campaign against illegal drugs on affected children, and have access to community-based aftercare and reintegration model, which includes relapse prevention sessions, counseling, health and fitness therapy, and spiritual interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I will report on the progress of the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights. The development and launch of the 3-year UN Joint Programme on Human Rights in the Philippines has been hailed by many states as an innovative model for constructive engagement between a country and the United Nations system on human rights. Technical cooperation under the joint programme is focused to support on national institutions and mechanisms and ongoing government programs. Various trainings, capacity building, and multi-stakeholder consultations have been undertaken, and the hundreds of participants in these activities attest to the good progress that has been attained in the implementation of the UNJP. The UNJP has a total budget of $10.21 million. Australia, the Netherlands, Ireland, Norway, the Republic of Korea, and the United Kingdom are contributors to the UNJP. The Philippine government has contributed $200,000 for 2022 and is considering a similar amount for 2023 and 2024. The technical working groups under the 6 main areas of cooperation are conducting strategic planning exercises and updating work plans for 2023. For your information, the composition of the working groups include government officials, UN country team, and civil society. I wish to now touch on the ICC issue. In the Philippines, rule of law and accountability are fully functioning through its criminal justice system and through continuing efforts to improve and strengthen new and existing mechanisms such as the AO35 mechanism. The Philippine government continues to uphold its commitment to fight impunity for atrocity crimes, notwithstanding the country's withdrawal from the Rome Statute, especially since the Philippines has a national legislation punishing atrocity crimes. As a court of last resort, the ICC complements but does not replace regional courts. It only operates in cases where national jurisdictions are unable or unwilling to prosecute. I will now touch on climate change. The Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, suffering from increased extreme weather events and natural disasters and sea level rise. Year after year, this has taken a heavy toll on our economy, our people, and their human rights. For this reason, more than a decade ago, the Philippines, along with a handful of forward-looking countries, pioneered the landmark Human Rights and Climate Change Resolution in this Council. Thanks to that initiative, the Paris Agreement has language on the link between climate change and human rights, in particularly the adverse effects of climate change on a range of human rights. In climate change talks, we aim for climate justice, climate financing and technology transfer, and meaningful ways to account for loss and damage. In accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, we called on industrialized nations to do more and immediately fulfill their mitigation and adaptation commitments and obligations. Thank you very much.
Finally, again on the ICC. The Philippines has a fully functioning legal and judicial system. The ICC should probably concern itself more with failed states, states at war, and states without any government in control. In spite of what the ICC prosecutor has said about our country, we are not closing our door to reviewing our position as a country vis-à-vis the Rome Statute. Of course, this will be done in consultation with all sectors of our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everybody of the delegation of the Philippines. And we will now continue with our interactive dialogue, and I have the honor to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شكرا السيدة.
In the name of God the Merciful, thank you very much, Madam Vice President. We welcome the positive steps taken by the Philippines to implement the UPR recommendations, including through the promulgation of laws aiming to guarantee social and economic development, such as the fiscal reform law and the universal health coverage law, and the law on the protection of vulnerable categories of the population. In the context of this constructive dialogue, we would make the following recommendations: to envisage adopting a strategy which is global to combat discrimination against persons with disabilities. Secondly, to guarantee protection for the most vulnerable categories of the population, including children, in the use of technology and internet. We wish the Philippines every success. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Lao.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Laupedia welcome the successful presidential election in May this year. We commend the Philippines for the progress made in the protection and promotion of human rights, namely the empowerment of the rights of vulnerable and marginalized groups such as women, people with disabilities, elderly, and children. My delegation would like to offer the following recommendations. 1. Enhancing the full and effective implementation of joint programs on universal access to health care, including sexual and reproductive health for women and girls, and further implementing the Basic Education Development Plan 2022 towards realizing inclusive and equitable access to quality education. I thank you, Madam Vice President. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Latvia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Latvia welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to the UPR Working Group and would like to recommend 1. To rejoin as a state party to the Rome Statute of the ICC and fully cooperate with the ICC prosecutor's investigation. 2. To ensure that all anti-drug laws and policies are in line with the Philippines' obligations under international human rights law. 3. To ensure prompt, independent, and impartial investigations of all instances of extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, and arbitrary arrests and detention of persons suspected of drug-related offenses, journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders, and civil society actors. 4. To take measures to foster a safe and respectful and enabling environment for civil society and human rights defenders, free from persecution, intimidation, and harassment. 5. To promote and protect the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and media freedom, as well as the safety of journalists. And 6. To consider extending a standing invitation to special procedures mandate holders of the Human Rights Council. We wish the delegation of Philippines success in the review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Lebanon.
Madam Vice President, Lebanon welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and thanks them for their national report and presentation and for the efforts to promote and protect human rights. Lebanon welcomes the introduction of a national mechanism for reporting and follow-up, as well as the Philippines Development Plan for the years 2017-2022. Furthermore, Lebanon welcomes the launch of the National Action Plan on the Safety of Journalists in 2020. In a spirit of constructive dialogue, we would recommend to 1. Adopt a legislation establishing a national preventive mechanism on torture in line with OPCAT stipulations. 2. Pursue the efforts undertaken in fighting human trafficking, online sexual abuse, and exploitation of children. In conclusion, we wish the Philippines all the success in the review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Libya.
Thank you, Vice President. We wish a warm welcome to the delegation of the Philippines and welcome their efforts during the UPR. We congratulate the government's efforts to create a national human rights institution. We have the following recommendations. Firstly, to adopt all necessary measures to guarantee the rights of persons with disabilities, including through their reintegration into society. Secondly, to pursue efforts in the education sphere to ensure that education be inclusive, including for persons with disabilities. We wish the Philippines every success. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Liechtenstein.
Liechtenstein welcomes the distinguished delegation of the Philippines and wishes to thank for the information provided in the introductory statement and in the national report. In a constructive spirit, Liechtenstein recommends that the Philippines first re-accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in its 2010 version. Second, conduct prompt, impartial, thorough and transparent investigations into all killings and alleged violations of international human rights law, with a view to prosecution and to the provision of remedies for victims and their families. And third, prevent and respond to human rights violations and abuses against human rights defenders and end incitement to violence and threatening rhetoric against human rights defenders, online and offline, including red tagging, and ensure accountability for any acts of intimidation or reprisal. We wish you a successful UPR and thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania welcomes the delegation of Philippines and thanks for its national report. We welcome the progress made by Philippines towards achieving inclusive growth and furthering the rights of women and children since the last UPR. However, Lithuania remains concerned regarding the continuing human rights violations in the context of war on drugs. We recommend to Philippines: 1. Ensure that human rights violations committed in the context of war on drugs are investigated and elaborate action plan for their prevention. 2. Fully comply with the obligations under the second optional protocol to the ICCPR and abandon all existing efforts to restore the death penalty. 3. Ensure implementation of the recently enacted Anti-Online Sexual Abuse and Exploitation of Children law and take measures to reduce all forms of violence against children. 4. Ensure implementation of the National Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Luxembourg, Ambassador.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Luxembourg welcomes a high-level delegation from the Philippines and thank them for the presentation of their national report and their efforts deployed to implement previous recommendations. On the basis of available reports and information and the priorities for our own activities within the Human Rights Council, my delegation invites the delegation of the Philippines to accept the following recommendations. 1. To present a standing invitation to all special procedure mandate holders. 2. To bring an end to impunity for acts of extrajudicial executions, ensuring impartial, in-depth and transparent investigations. 3. To not reintroduce the death penalty. 4. To establish an effective system of protection for human rights defenders and journalists, guaranteeing the free exercise of their rights to freedom of opinion, expression and association. 5. To free without delay all persons arbitrarily detained. 6. To ratify again the Rome Statute on the ICC. Thank you.
And I now give the floor to Madagascar.
Monsieur le Président,
President, Madagascar thanks the Philippines for their report in the context of this UPR cycle. Madagascar commends the government of the Philippines on the adoption of the 2021 law on migrant workers and the creation of the Department for Migrant Workers in order to strengthen protection accorded to Philippine nationals working abroad and also the establishment of a national action plan on just and ethical recruitment practices. However, given gender-based violence against women and girls with disabilities, Madagascar recommends to the Philippines to develop a strategy aiming to protect these women and girls from all forms of violence based on gender. Given the treaties ratified by the Philippine government, CEDAW and the CRPD, the government of Madagascar wishes the government of the Philippines every success in promoting and protecting human rights. Thank you.
And I now give the floor to Malaysia.
Thank you, Chair. Malaysia thanks the Philippines for its report. Malaysia commends the Philippines for the various efforts taken to promote and protect human rights of its people. We encourage the Philippines to continue implementing robust and pragmatic policies, especially those targeted for specific groups, such as women, children, and persons with disabilities. Malaysia also appreciates the Philippines' important contribution to ASEAN community building and the realization of the ASEAN Common Human Rights Agenda. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Malaysia recommends the following. 1. Strengthen efforts in creating a safe space for women and children online, including through intensified awareness-raising campaign against all forms of sexual exploitation and abuse. And 2. Ensure effective implementation of the Basic Education Development Plan 2030, particularly in terms of expanding access to quality education for children and youth in disadvantaged situations. Malaysia wishes the Philippines every success.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Maldives.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Maldives warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation from Philippines to this fourth cycle review and thanks the delegation for their presentation today. The Maldives commends the efforts by Philippines to protect the environment and address climate change. We take positive note of the work being carried out to re-examine current mining practices and promoting sustainable development practices. In constructive spirit, the Maldives makes the following 2 recommendations. 1. Further enhance measures to address the gender-based violence against women and violence against children with disabilities. And 2. Continue efforts to establish a national preventive mechanism on torture. We wish the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Republic of the Marshall Islands warmly welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to this fourth UPR cycle. We commend the Philippines for its efforts to address the human rights impact of climate change and its leadership in the HRC in drawing greater attention to the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. In the spirit of constructive engagement, we recommend the following. 1. Cease all attempts to reintroduce the death penalty, including the proposed bills to restore the death penalty for drug-related offenses. And 2. Implement a national strategy to address the high levels of gender-based violence against women and girls, particularly those with disabilities, including from sexual violence and abuse. We wish the delegation every success during its fourth UPR cycle. Komoltada, and I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Mauritius.
Chair, Mauritius would like to extend a very warm welcome to the high-level municipal delegation from the Philippines attending this fourth cycle of the UPR. We applaud the efforts of the government of the Philippines for ensuring that its population had universal access to COVID-19 vaccines during the pandemic. We further congratulate the Philippines for having put in place the Basic Education Learning Continuity Plan for school year 2020-2021 in light of the COVID-19 public health emergency. In a brotherly spirit, Mauritius would like to recommend to the Philippines that it establish or promote an appropriate framework to protect women against gender-based violence. We wish the Philippines a very successful review and continued progress. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Mexico. Ambassador.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. We welcome the delegation of the Philippines, and we welcome the adoption of the law on migrant workers and the launch of the joint UN program on human rights. Mexico recommends the following. 1. To provide training for judges and social workers on recognizing the legal capacity of persons with disability. 2. To speed up efforts to approve the law on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression and the comprehensive law against discrimination. Thirdly, to bring the law on preventing, prohibiting and criminalizing terrorism into line with international human rights standards and to approve the law on human rights defenders. Fourthly, to ensure a human rights-based approach is at the core of the strategy against illegal drugs. Mexico has experience to share here and technical assistance as well. We wish Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Montenegro. Ambassador.
Montenegro welcomes the distinguished delegation of the Philippines. Montenegro notes the presented progress in the implementation of Philippines' commitments from the last UPR. We recognize that certain efforts are being made to pursue accountability for human rights violations and abuses. However, tangible progress is still lacking. We welcome the declared commitment of the new Philippines administration to the implementation of a 3-year UN joint program on human rights. We call upon the authorities to deepen technical cooperation with OHCHR, also by inviting the office to provide advice on counter-terrorism legislation. Montenegro recommends 1. To adopt legislation establishing a national preventive mechanism on torture, and 2. To take further measures to conduct prompt, impartial, thorough, transparent investigation into all killings in the context of anti-drug war. We wish the Philippines every success. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Morocco.
Madam Vice President, first of all, my delegation would like to welcome the distinguished delegation of the Philippines to its fourth cycle UPR review and would like to express its appreciation for the presentation of its national report. Morocco would like to commend the government of the Philippines for the many steps and achievements in fulfilling human rights obligations since its last UPR review, including implementing the third Philippine Human Rights Plan and adhering to international standards and cooperation in the anti-illegal drug campaign. In a spirit of constructive engagement, my delegation would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Ratify the Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. And 2. Continue efforts aimed at improving access to justice and for vulnerable people such as persons with disabilities. Morocco wishes the delegation of the Philippines a successful review. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Namibia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Namibia welcomes this opportunity to have a constructive dialogue with the esteemed delegation of the Philippines on the human rights impacting measures taken by the Philippines during the period under review. Namibia, among other things, applauds the Philippines for measures taken to advance protection for the rights of children and the premium it places on protecting the environment and addressing climate change. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, we offer the following recommendations for consideration by the Philippines. 1. Ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. 2. Ratify the International Labour Organization's Violence and Harassment Convention number 190 of 2019. We wish the delegation of the Philippines a successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Nepal.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Nepal warmly welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to the fourth cycle of UPR and thanks them for the presentation of National Report. We take note of the efforts made by the Philippines to implement the recommendations made in the earlier UPR cycle. We take encouraging note of the enactment of the Safe Spaces Act 2019 that penalizes gender-based sexual harassment committed in public spaces and the formulation of the updated Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Plan. While wishing the Philippines a successful fourth cycle review, we recommend the following for their consideration. 1. Continue making efforts to better protect the rights of migrant workers and their families. 2. Enhance measures to protecting the rights of children against all forms of violence and sexual exploitation. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Netherlands welcomes the efforts of the Philippines to address human rights concerns through the UN Joint Program, especially in relation to its anti-drug campaign. We encourage the Philippines to ensure full implementation of the program to achieve accountability. We remain, however, concerned about shrinking civic spaces and serious threats to civil society actors and journalists. The Netherlands recommends the Philippines to 1. Take all necessary steps to foster a safe environment for human rights offenders and journalists in the exercise of their rights to freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly and association by decriminalizing libel laws and enact a human rights offenders protection bill. 2. Decriminalize abortion and ensure that there are no criminal penalties for any services related to abortion care. We wish the Philippines every success with this UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Niger.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Niger wishes a warm welcome to the delegation of the Philippines and congratulates them on the presentation of the national report, as well as on progress achieved since its last UPR. Niger takes note of the constant commitment of the Philippines to honour international obligations and their desire to bolster human rights protection through a system of democratic governance involving civil society and protecting freedom of the press. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, we recommend to the Philippines to 1. Ratify the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. 2. To ratify the optional protocol of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Finally, Niger wishes the delegation of the Philippines every success in this review. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Nigeria warmly welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to the presentation of its national report and commends the government for its continued cooperation with human rights mechanisms and commitment to its international human rights obligations. Nigeria takes positive note of the efforts made by the government of the Philippines to ensure the promotion and protection of the rights and fundamental freedom of its people, including the rights of the life of the unborn. In addition, Nigeria commends the commitment of the government to improve the social economic well-being of its people through continued commitment to the implementation of the Philippines Development Plan 2017 to 2022. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, Nigeria wishes to make the following recommendations. 1. To remain committed to the full and effective implementation of the United Nations Joint Programme, and 2. To scale up efforts in combating human trafficking and the protection of the rights of the victims of trafficking. Finally, Nigeria wishes Philippines a very successful review process. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to Norway.
Madam Vice President, as one of the initial donors to the UN Joint Programme for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in the Philippines, Norway is pleased that progress has been made in the programme's 6 focus areas. Norway recommends that the Philippines, 1, ensures swift investigation, prosecution and accountability of perpetrators who contributed to the so-called war on drugs, including by providing effective remedies to victims. 2, promotes a safe and enabling environment for human rights defenders, including by promoting their legitimacy and importance and ensuring that they are not subject to arbitrary arrests or detention. 3, re-examines libel provisions of the revised Penal Code and the Cybercrime Prevention Act of 2012 to ensure that these laws are not used to limit freedom of expression. And 4, implements the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act of 2012, including by increasing access to modern contraceptives. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Oman.
شكرا سعادة نائبة الرئيس. يسرني أن أرحب.
Thank you very much, Vice President. A cordial welcome to the delegation of the Philippines. We pay tribute to their efforts to prepare the national report, as well as the participatory approach underpinning their cooperation with this 4th cycle of the UPR mechanism. My delegation has taken note of the Philippines report, and we thank the Philippines for the measures taken in the framework of the constructive dialogue. We have the following recommendations: to continue work in the framework of the program for combating drugs to protect individuals and families, and secondly, to continue the strategy for protecting oceans and tackling climate change. Thirdly, to continue their policies aimed at ensuring right to work in humane and fair and dignified conditions. To conclude, we would like to wish the Philippines every success for this review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We thank and welcome the delegation of the Philippines for presentation of its 4th UPR report and commend its cooperation with the UPR mechanism. We recognize the legislative, administrative and policy measures, especially the enactment of the Filipino Sign Language Act 2018, National Climate Risk Management Framework 2019, Nutritious Food for the Filipino Child Act 2018, and the steps taken to protect the land possession and ownership rights of the indigenous peoples. We recommend the following. 1. Continued measures to eradicate violence against women, children, and vulnerable groups. 2. Expansion of projects to tackle the negative impacts of climate change, especially for the most risk-prone communities. And 3. Further reinforce steps taken for integration of drug addicts into the society and strengthen the campaign to address the proliferation of illegal drugs. We wish the Philippines a successful UPR. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Panama.
Señora Presidenta.
Vice President, Panama thanks the Philippines for the presentation of the national report. We have the following recommendations. 1. To implement the commitment taken on during the Nairobi Summit on the International Conference on People and Development, 25, to increase investment and cooperation for reproductive health care and the other actions that are necessary to make swifter progress towards achieving the CIPD's goals and the 2030 Agenda. To adopt a legislative and policy framework that is based on human rights for the protection of the rights of people who are displaced by natural disaster, armed conflict, crime and violence. To cooperate with civil society and the Human Rights Commission to develop and implement an anti-drug policy that includes a public health-based approach and a human rights-based approach. We wish the Philippines a successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to Paraguay.
Paraguay Paraguay would like to extend a warm greeting to the Philippines, and we thank them for the report. We welcome the progress achieved by the Philippines, especially the approval of the strategic plan to prevent and combat serious human rights violations of children in situations of armed conflict. We are concerned by the legal initiatives aimed at reintroducing the death penalty for drug-related crimes, and we encourage the Philippines to continue their efforts to tackle these particular challenges. Paraguay has the following recommendations. 1. To ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, as well as the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Secondly, to step up their legislative and policy mechanisms for preventing and combating violence against women and to protect children and adolescents. Thirdly, to repeal legal provisions that prevent persons with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities to exercise their right to political participation. Fourthly, to establish a national mechanism for implementing, reporting and follow-up for the recommendations in the field of human rights, considering the possibility of receiving cooperation to this end. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Peru.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Peru welcomes the delegation of the Philippines, and we thank them for the presentation. In a constructive spirit, Peru recommends 1. To consider incorporating in its legislation disabilities, both physical and mental disabilities, as a ground for potential discrimination, and to continue creating public policies that include people with disabilities so as to ensure that they can exercise their rights in equal conditions and on the basis of gender equality. To step up efforts to investigate allegations of arbitrary detentions and extrajudicial killings in an expeditious and independent fashion. Thirdly, to improve the conditions in detention centres, especially as regards providing prenatal and postnatal care for pregnant and breastfeeding women. We wish the Philippines a successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Portugal.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Portugal welcomes the delegation of the Philippines. We salute the launch of the first national UN Joint Programme on Human Rights and the convening of the first Philippine Human Rights Defenders National Assembly. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, Portugal recommends that the Philippines, 1. Reconsiders to rejoin the Rome Statute of the ICC, 2. Fosters impartial investigations on extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances, and 3. Promotes workers' right to collective bargaining, to social protection, and makes further efforts to eradicate poverty and to fight human trafficking. Portugal wishes the Philippines a successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Qatar.
السيدة نائب الرئيس نرحب بوفد الفلبين.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. A warm welcome to the Philippines, and we pay tribute to their cooperation with the human rights mechanisms. The Philippines are implementing the recommendations that they accepted in the past, especially as regards development through the development plan for 2017 to 2022. These include a number of work streams, including quality education, its continuity, as well as universal health coverage and rural development, as well as the fight against climate change. We encourage the Philippines to continue the implementation of the 2011-2028 plan. We have the following recommendations. Firstly, to continue its efforts against human trafficking and to take further steps to protect victims of human trafficking. Secondly, to take measures to protect the rights of children, especially online. Every success to the Philippines during this review.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Republic of Korea welcomes the delegation of the Philippines to its fourth cycle of the UPR. The Republic of Korea recommends the Philippines for its efforts to implement the recommendations received during its last review, including the steps taken to improve the rights of the child. In particular, we welcome the adoption of legislative measures aimed at ending child marriage and protecting children from sexual abuse and exploitation. In a constructive spirit, we'd like to present the following recommendations. 1. Ensure a human rights-based approach to drug control. 2. Continue its efforts to guarantee a safe and enabling environment for the work of independent media and civil society organizations. And 3. ensure that the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines can continue to operate independently in line with the Paris principles. We wish the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Romania.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Romania welcomes the Philippines delegation and the UPR report. While commending its efforts in advancing human rights protection, including through the third National Human Rights Action Plan, and with regard to women representation in public life and migrant workers, Romania would like to recommend the Philippines to draft and adopt the next National Human Rights Action Plan that with the meaningful participation of relevant stakeholders while continuing to effectively contribute to the implementation of the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights. Take measures to protect women and children from domestic violence while ensuring access to multiple forms of reporting of these cases, information about their rights and available remedies. Implement the recently adopted anti-trafficking and anti-online sexual abuse or exploitation laws. Replace the punitive approach on war of drugs policy with one of control in line with ICCPR and prioritize accountability for human rights violations committed in this context, as well as for redress for victims and their families. Adopt a Human Rights Defenders Bill to protect HRDs and journalists from reprisals, including red tagging practice and killings. We wish the Philippines delegation a successful outcome of the UPR.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Samoa.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We warmly welcome the high-level delegation of the Philippines and commend them on their progress in the promotion and protection of human rights. Samoa would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Engage constructively with marginalized and vulnerable groups in regards to climate change policies and disaster risk reduction plans. 2. To identify technical assistance and international partnerships needed to assist in adaptation efforts, emissions reductions, and loss and damage. And 3. Request assistance from the OHCHR and international partners where relevant for the strengthening of the NMIRF, in particular with activities relating to the National Recommendations Tracking Database. We wish the Philippines every success in the UPR. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to Saudi Arabia.
شكرا سيدة نائبة الرئيس. يطيب.
Thank you, Vice President. Allow me to first of all wish a warm welcome to the delegation of the Philippines. We would like to praise their national report and their positive cooperation with the international human rights mechanisms. We also commend them on the results they have achieved and the efforts made to protect human rights. We have the following recommendations to offer. Firstly, to move forward on the implementation of the National Plan for Tackling Climate Change 2011-2028. Secondly, to continue beefing up programs aimed at ensuring universal health coverage. To conclude, we wish the Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Sierra Leone.
Madam Vice President, Sierra Leone welcomes the high-level delegation of the Philippines and thanks them for the comprehensive national report. Sierra Leone recommend for the consideration of the Philippines, 1. Consider to abolish the law of red tagging and review the operational conduct of the National Task Force on Ending Local Communist Armed Conflict. 2. Abolish the death penalty. 3. Adopt an effective mechanism in accordance with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030. We applaud the Philippines, like Sierra Leone, for investing in human capital development through quality technical, vocational education and training. We note that over 9 million TVET enrollees were registered between 2017 to July 2022 with a 94.8% completion rate. We applaud the Philippines for its continued financial support to the OHCHR office. We welcome President Marcos Jr.'s approach against illegal drugs that includes rehabilitation, prevention, education and assistance to victims and their families. We wish the Philippines every success during this review, and I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Slovenia.
Excellencies, Slovenia welcomes the commitment of the government of Philippines to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights. The Philippines has also shown progress in furthering the right of women and children. However, we are concerned that abortion is still illegal under the Penal Code. we wish to recommend to the Philippines to decriminalize abortion through an amendment to the revised penal code. We would suggest aligning the access to abortion with the latest WHO guidelines, or at least in cases where a woman's or girl's life or health is in danger, when the pregnancy is a result of rape or incest, and in case of fetal malformations. We wish Philippines every success in this UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Singapore.
Madam Vice President, Singapore welcomes the delegation of our fellow ASEAN member state, the Philippines, and congratulates them on their efforts and progress since their last UPR in 2017. The Philippines has placed a strong emphasis on environmental protection and addressing the impact of climate change. This includes whole-of-government initiatives such as the National Climate Change Action Plan for 2011 to 2028. Mindful of the great impact that climate change can have on the enjoyment of human rights, Singapore recommends that the Philippines continue to ensure that adequate support be given to implement its national climate change-related policies. The Philippines has also been active in ensuring the right to access education for its citizens. Proven by the increasing enrollment at all education levels, Singapore recommends that the Philippines continues its efforts to make education accessible for all, especially girls and others in vulnerable situations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Spain.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Spain welcomes the delegation of the Philippines. We commend the goodwill of the Filipino government to cooperate with the United Nations on strengthening human rights mechanisms. We recommend, firstly, to continue developing the joint program with the United Nations on technical assistance and capacity building. This will undoubtedly improve effective remedy and ensure universal access to justice. Secondly, to step up necessary mechanisms in order to put an end immediately to extrajudicial killings and enforce disappearances, and to hold the perpetrators to account by ratifying the Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. Thirdly, to put an end to threats and attacks against human rights defenders, journalists and the media, and to promote effective institutional measures which meet international standards on the use of force. Fourthly, to ensure that the Philippines, as a signatory to the second optional protocol to the ICCPR, continue respecting, as it has done so far, its commitments against the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka warmly welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and appreciates the presentation of a comprehensive national report. Sri Lanka welcomes the commitment of the Philippines to comply with its international obligations and cooperate with human rights mechanisms as evidenced by the ratification of 8 core human rights treaties. We acknowledge the progress achieved by the Philippines on its human rights commitments during the third cycle and the full implementation of all 3 accepted recommendations. We take this opportunity to recommend that the Philippines ensure universal access to health services and access to the minimum initial service package during emergencies and disasters. Continue the commitment towards the promotion and protection of the rights and welfare of migrant workers as enacted in the law of December 2021, creating the Department of Migrant Workers. Continue the priority afforded to maintaining access to and delivery of public education and ensure access to education for groups in situations of disadvantage. We wish the Philippines every success in its UPR engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Sudan, Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Sudan welcomes the Philippines delegation and thank them for their report. Sudan appreciates the positive steps taken by Philippines, including ensuring the civic space through protecting and promoting the freedoms of media, expression, association, cooperation with NGOs, as well as the holding of the national election in May 2022. Sudan welcomes the legislative reform efforts and the implementation of the Philippine Development Plan for 2017-2022. Sudan recommends that Philippines to continue its efforts to ensure the rights to development as well as the implementation of the SDGs. Sudan wishes the Philippines a successful cycle of review. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Sweden.
Vice President, Sweden acknowledges the stated ambitions of the new government regarding human rights and will closely follow which concrete steps will be taken to improve the situation. We remain deeply concerned by the continued harassment and violence, including deadly violence against human rights and environmental defenders, indigenous peoples and journalists, the continued impunity related to the war on drugs, and the continued practice of red tagging. Sweden would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Take concrete steps against extrajudicial killings to ensure that all unresolved murders in the country are properly investigated and the persons responsible held accountable in accordance with due process and the rule of law. 2. End the practice of red tagging of groups and individuals. 3. Pass the comprehensive anti-discrimination bill and the Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Gender Expression Equality Bill in order to guarantee the protection of LGBTIQ persons. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Switzerland.
Madam Vice President, Switzerland welcomes the delegation of the Philippines and makes the following recommendations. 1. To order, starting from the highest level of the state, law enforcement bodies to abstain from any conduct which violates international law, in particular extrajudicial executions, arbitrary arrests, and acts of torture and other ill treatment. 2. To conduct in-depth, impartial, independent, transparent, and effective investigations into assassinations, intimidation, and harassment of journalists and human rights defenders, and to bring those suspected perpetrators to justice through fair trials. 3. To refrain from reintroducing the death penalty in conformity with international obligations. 4. To rapidly promulgate the law on the protection of human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا. نرحب. Thank you. We would like to thank the head of the delegation, and we appreciate the presentation of the comprehensive report. We appreciate the priority the Philippines is according to the access to public education and the fact that the largest portion in the general budget is allocated to the education sector. We also note the importance given to investing in developing human capital by ensuring the quality of vocational education and that its programs are responsive to changes in economic needs and the labor market. Climate change has multiple impacts on different areas in life in the Philippines. Through its National Climate Change Action Plan 2011-2028, the Philippines has succeeded to coordinate national efforts to address and mitigate these impacts. We recommend consider means to expand benefits from international cooperation in order to strengthen national efforts to counter and mitigate the impacts of climate change and continue the efforts to enhance access to education for persons with disabilities and provide reasonable facilitating accommodation for this purpose. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Thailand, Ambassador.
Madam Vice President, my delegation welcomes the Philippine delegation led by His Excellency the Secretary of Justice to this UPR session. Thailand would like to highlight the following issues. First, Thailand recognizes the Philippines' continuous efforts in the promotion and protection of human rights of migrants at regional and international levels. Second, we welcome the Philippines' endeavors in combating online sexual abuse and exploitation of children. We recommend the Philippines to continue strengthening actions in the aspect of legislations, awareness raising, and training of government officers. Third, Thailand commends the Philippines in working closely with the UN and stakeholders under the joint program. We recommend the Philippines to explore additional technical cooperation and capacity building exercises which would complement the implementation of the 6 key areas of the joint program. As a fellow ASEAN member state, Thailand wishes the Philippines a successful review and effective implementation of the recommendation. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Timor-Leste.
Madam Vice President, Timor-Leste commends the progress made by the Philippines on human rights since its last UPR, including the signature of the strategic plan to prevent and respond to grave child rights violations in situation of armed conflict between the UN and the Philippines Armed Forces, and the release of the Philippines National Police Child Protection Policy. Timor-Leste recommends that the Philippines implement confidence-building measures to foster trust with civil society organizations and facilitate their engagement with state institutions mandated to respond to human rights concerns, continue to strengthen the independence of judiciary and the capacity of the judicial system, maintain the abolition of the death penalty and refrain from reintroducing it, strengthen efforts to enact a comprehensive anti-discrimination law that protects all persons from all forms of discrimination, and ensure that the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are respected and protected. We wish the Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Togo.
Vice President, Togo commends the progress accomplished by the Philippines, in particular the effective implementation of their third Human Rights Action Plan and the Philippines Development Plan. My delegation takes note of the development and implementation by the government of the Philippines of different programs to minimize the risks of drug dependency. Togo encourages the Philippines to pursue their efforts and recommends the following. 1. To ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances and the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. 3. To proceed to ratify the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And then to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, establishing a communications procedure. Finally, Togo wishes the Philippines every success in this review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Tunisia.
شكرا السيدة نائبة الرئيس.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. A warm welcome to the delegation of the Philippines, whom we thank for the presentation of the report. We commend the implementation by the Philippines of the recommendations from the last UPR cycle. We also commend the adoption of the National Development Plan 2017-2022 aimed at promoting human rights, including those of vulnerable groups and individuals. We have the following recommendations. Firstly, to continue efforts to ensure access to education and information, especially for persons with disabilities and vulnerable groups of the population. Secondly, to continue improving access to basic public health services, in particular as regards sexual and reproductive health in rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Turkey.
And a warm welcome to the delegation of Philippines, and thanks to its comprehensive presentation. We recognize the Philippine government's continuing efforts to strengthen policy measures and institutional mechanism on human rights. We note His Excellency President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s determination to continue with a progressive human rights agenda. We commend Philippines' cooperation and constructive engagement with the UN human rights bodies. We would like to recommend the following. 1. Implement the decision of the Philippine Department of Justice to embark on inclusive consultations on the improved functioning of the Interagency Committee that addresses violations of human rights. 2. Continue policies aimed at strengthening domestic human rights mechanism. We wish the Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Ukraine.
National Report. Ukraine positively notes the efforts of the Philippines to eradicate discrimination, especially violence against women, by implementation of the National Advocacy and Communication Strategic Plan, as well as the engagement of the country in protecting the environment by adopting the National Framework Strategy on Climate Change and National Climate Change Action Plan. We also encourage the Philippines to undertake important steps to strengthen its judicial system and human rights protection mechanisms. And to further build on these achievements, we recommend, first, to intensify efforts towards ratification of the outstanding human rights treaties, and second, take steps to implement a comprehensive victim-centric and human rights-based approach to the drug problem. We wish the Philippines a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
الرئيس يرحب وفد بلادي بوفد جمهورية.
Thank you. We welcome the delegations of the Philippines, led by the Minister for Justice. We commend the Philippines' determination to promote human rights at the national level in cooperation with international organizations working in the field. We also commend the implementation of the joint program with the United Nations, which is implemented in partnership with the various social stakeholders and which aims to improve reforms around human rights. We would like to offer the following recommendations. Firstly, to strengthen measures and programs aimed at implementing the National Plan Against Climate Change in full respect of human rights. Secondly, to continue efforts geared towards ensuring the rights of children, especially with regard to girls' education and rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Vice President, the UK notes the positive statements made by the new Filipino government on adopting a drugs policy which respects human rights. However, we do remain concerned with the ongoing climate of impunity around extrajudicial killings. We recommend that the Philippines, 1, agrees an ambitious national human rights action plan in consultation with civil society organisations, 2, prioritises the accountability of those who commit extrajudicial killings, including those committed during the so-called war on drugs, and 3, promotes the protection and law of Indigenous peoples and civil society representatives, including human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United Republic of Tanzania.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We further commend Philippines for the legislations and policy interventions adopted to protect children and women from violence and for the efforts taken to address malnutrition in children. In the spirit of constructive engagement, we recommend that the government maintains the efforts already undertaken to further increase enrollment of children in schools, especially that of girls. The United Republic of Tanzania wishes the delegation of Philippines a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United States of America, Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The United States welcomes the distinguished delegation from the Philippines led by their Secretary of Justice. We appreciate the commitment of the Philippines to advance accountability for extrajudicial killings under the UN Joint Program and encourage continued technical cooperation with the UN to strengthen domestic investigation and accountability mechanisms. We recommend that the Philippines, 1, end the practice of red tagging and ensure protection of human rights defenders from arbitrary arrest, harassment, and other human rights abuses, including by adopting the Human Rights Defenders Protection Act. 2, review and revise laws and regulations that unduly restrict or inhibit freedom of expression and independent media, including Penal Code Articles 353 and 355, the Cybercrime Prevention Act of 2012, and Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, Section 9. 3, continue to conduct impartial, transparent, and thorough investigations into all allegations of extrajudicial killings and violations of human rights relating to drug enforcement operations and hold perpetrators accountable. We wish the Philippines a successful UPR. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Hungary. Ambassador.
The Philippines for its national report and presentation. Hungary is pleased to know that since its last UPR, the Philippines has continued to intensify efforts to protect children from all forms of violence, exploitation, and abuse. We welcome that the country's engagement with civil society organizations, including human rights defenders and representatives of indigenous peoples, has been further strengthened. Hungary notes with appreciation measures aiming at expanding access to quality education by groups in situation of disadvantage and the renewed focus on reforms to improve access to and delivery of justice for all. We encourage the the continued implementation of these important measures and initiatives, Hungary wishes to make the following 2 recommendations. Continue strengthening efforts to promote inclusive access to quality education through the implementation of the Basic Education Development Plan 2030, and further continue to enhance programs and mechanisms to combat sexual abuse and exploitation of children both online and offline. We wish every success to the Philippines in this UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this was the last speaker on my list. And I now give the floor back to Honorable Jesus Crispin Rumola, Secretary, Department of Justice, to address your observations and comments and to make his final remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, Madam Chair. First of all, I'd like to categorically state that there is no government policy of engaging in red tagging, which is a term invented by the left to protect the left. There is no such policy of engaging in red tagging. I will now read my closing statement. Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe that we had an open and productive dialogue this morning. We thank all delegations that recognize the significant strides the Philippine government has made in fulfilling its solemn duty to the Filipino people to promote and protect their fundamental and inalienable human rights since the 3rd cycle of the UPR in 2017. We take note of the recommendations that have been propounded and assure you we will study them very carefully with a view to adopting those that will help us advance our national human rights agenda. We would also like to recognize the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines and civil society organizations that have contributed to this process, as well as our media back home that are covering this event, thus helping raise the public's awareness of human rights issues. The Philippine government recognizes the vital role they play in our democracy and in upholding the dignity of each and every Filipino. Their participation in the different stages of the UPR attests to the robustness of our civic space, where open and lively discourse on human rights is enabled and welcomed. This 4th cycle of the UPR comes at the most opportune time. We have a new government that is strongly committed to reforms and to a people-centered and human rights-based governance and development agenda. The end-term assessment of the 3rd Philippine Human Rights Action Plan is scheduled in the 1st quarter of 2023, and soon after, we will begin crafting the 4th iteration of the Philippine Human Rights Plan. This will be done through an inclusive and multi-stakeholder process, including the Commission on Human Rights and civil society organizations. The recommendations and comments arising from this review, as well as those from treaty bodies and the enhanced interactive dialogue we had last October at HRC 51, will feed into this process. Our dialogue today has strengthened our belief in the utility of the UPR as a constructive process for the assessment and promotion of state compliance with international human rights standards. Madam Chair, Excellencies, as we conclude this review process, allow me to reiterate 2 very important messages. First, the Philippines is firmly committed to human rights and the rule of law, for these are the cornerstones of a functioning democracy. In over a century of nation-building and democratic consolidation, we have built strong legal frameworks and institutions to guarantee human rights and foster social justice in our country. Our democratic and human rights institutions are working, but there is, of course, room for improvement. This we acknowledge with all sincerity and openness. Let me emphasize that the Philippine government is willing and able to address the gaps where they exist. As I have said earlier, we are pursuing comprehensive transformational reforms across all 5 pillars of our justice system. These are game-changing reforms aimed at redefining the Philippines' legal culture in order for us to deliver real justice in real time, for which we owe to the Filipino people. Second, in this reform journey, we welcome constructive engagement with those that can help us, including civil society, partners in the international community, and UN human rights mechanisms. Aside from the UN Joint Program on Human Rights, I am pleased to note that the Department of Justice has an ongoing technical cooperation program with the European Union to strengthen domestic accountability mechanisms. We are committed to fully implementing the agreed work program under GoJust 2. Human rights, the rule of law, and democracy are also important areas of cooperation with bilateral partners such as the United States and Australia. As it is in all countries, the promotion and protection of human rights is a never-ending job. We will fix what needs fixing and improve what needs improving. But we have a strong foundation and commitment to human rights that will not waver. Human rights are intrinsic in the fabric of Philippine society and democracy. In this regard, we welcome partnerships to help us move forward, partnerships that respect the sovereignty and agency of the Philippine government to fulfill its obligations and do right by its own people. Let me end by thanking our friends from the Troika, Marshall Islands, Namibia, and Poland, and the Secretariat for the support and efficient facilitation of this review process. My delegation looks forward to working with you in the finalization of the working group's report on the Philippines. Thank you. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much. And I thank the entire delegation for the presentation and participation in this review. The report of the review will be prepared by the members of the Troika, namely the representatives of Marshall Islands, Namibia, and Poland. In accordance with the procedure implemented since 2015, the recommendation section is scheduled for distribution on Wednesday, November the 16th at 12:30 p.m. and will be considered for adoption on the same day as from 3:30 p.m. The full report, including the summary section, will be circulated by email on Friday, 25th of November 2022. This brings us to the end of our meeting. We will reconvene this afternoon at 2:30 p.m. for the review of Brazil. Speaking time will be 1 minute for all. Inscribed speakers who wish to withdraw from the list are kindly invited to inform the Secretariat at the latest 30 minutes before the start of the review. I hereby close the 11th meeting of the 41st UPR Working Group session. Thank you very much, everybody.